And I'd like to welcome Commissioner Brown, who is joining us via the phone. Commissioner Brown, can you hear us?
I sure can. Thank you. Thanks for letting me do this by phone.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us today. So first, the next item that we have is item H, and this is the request for approval of the draft 2017 Oregon Department of Transportation's ADA transition plan, rather. And this is an item that had been before us, and we had a very detailed presentation. So today is meant to be an abbreviated approval, and I want to go ahead and turn it over to, yes, Ms. Crane, go right ahead. The floor is yours.
All right. Good afternoon, Chair Bainey, members of the Commission. I'm Angela Crane, Manager for Odot's Office of Civil Rights. With me today is Bob Pappy, Odot State Traffic Roadway Engineer and Interim Chief Engineer. So as you recall, last month we made a presentation before this Commission on the draft ADA transition plan, as well as the ADA lawsuit settlement and the progress that was made towards our ADA program. Last month, we shared that we had completed the transition plan review process, including Federal Highways review, and that we were at the point of asking you to formally approve the plan. On that morning of the Commission meeting last month, we learned that the draft transition plan and the settlement agreement had not been posted prior to the Commission meeting as planned. So those documents were then immediately posted that morning and have been available online since. So in the last month, after a thorough review, we have received no additional comments or questions. So as stated, we are back here today to answer any questions that you may have and ask that you formally approve the transition plan. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. And Commissioner Brown, since you're not in the room, I'll go ahead and start with you. Do you have any questions?
No questions. I think the information we got last month was perfect.
Wonderful. All right. Other commissioners, questions?
Addressed already.
Okay, if not, I would welcome a motion.
Madam Chair, I move approval of the draft 2017 ODOT ADA transition plan.
Okay. Further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
All right. Motion carries. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next item on the agenda is an information item, and it's the discussion of the Oregon Transportation Commission's actions to date on the draft 2018-21 statewide transportation improvement program, and this is in preparation for the next iteration of the program. Thank you. Ms. Bohart, am I turning it over to you?
Thank you. Good afternoon. For the record, my name is Jerry Bohart. I'm the Transportation Development Division Administrator. Can I have the slide? Thank you. And with me is Paul Mather, Head of Highway, and then Travis Brower, Assistant Director. So I'm going to sort of run through some of the steps that we've taken with the 28-21 STIP. Had a little bit of a conversation this earlier, and I think hopefully you were able to see in the staff report all the links and the various information that we've shared with you as a commission. Really appreciate this. We're trying to always figure out the best way to show this picture, but I think what we're really trying to get the message across here is that we really have 3 STIPs going at any one time. So the one that's in effect, the one that we're hoping that you'll gavel down on in July, and then in July we're going to talk to you about the process for the next one. So I know Jeff Flowers is in the audience, and that picture probably makes him twitch a little bit. So. One of the real important things about this is that you see in the red federal highways, and you see that we pretty much takes about 3 months for them to do approval. And it's also, even though this says FHWA, the Federal Transit Association also reviews this and provides their approval. And in some of the later kind of conversations, you're going to hear about STIP amendments. This little red box becomes even more important because you're going to realize there's going to be some sort of transition STIP amendments that are going to happen just because of the timing between all of these STIPs. So that's why STIP amendments become a pretty important conversation for us. This really is just, again, just to articulate sort of all the times that we were in front of the Commission having various discussions about the STIP. And you can say that pretty much takes a 3-year timeline to do that. And we're envisioning probably something similar when we talk about the 21-24 STIP. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of the steps in here. I think probably a little bit different. In October of 2014, Going back to the 15-18 STIP, that was the first time the commission did enhance and fix it. And so we did an evaluation of that, and that was presented to the commission at their workshop along in front of our ACT chairs as well. And I think that really sort of set the stage for the next update. Just for those of you who haven't been necessarily involved with the STIP Stakeholder Committee, they've been around since 2001. I think it was one of the first assignments I was given when I joined the agency, and it's still attached to me. So they're a great committee. They really help frame the STIP criteria. It's made up of about 17 members. It's morphed a little bit over time, but it includes representatives from our area commissions on transportation, metropolitan planning organizations, federal highways, Department of Land Conservation and Development, AOC, Association of Counties, League of Cities, AAA, our advisory committees, Trucking Association, environmental. So you kind of get it really represents, I think, our key stakeholders interested in transportation. They've been involved in framing criteria from the time of the OTIA, with the Transportation Investment Act, as well as JTA, and just well as we've progressed with our STIP process. So I think they're kind of a really important group. So one of the things that I think that we've, as we've gone through the process, and it's sort of hard to see here, is one of the first things we really did was talk about scenarios, and really talk about scenarios around federal funding. And I think that will be a conversation that we have in July. Certainly in the past STIP with the 15-18, there was a lot of uncertainty about exactly what our transportation funding would look like. With the FAST Act, we got a little bit more certainty, but again, if you go, as we start to progress to the 21-24, the FAST Act doesn't go as far as the 21-24. So one of the first things that we have a conversation with the Commission is what assumptions do we make around federal funds. So while it's hard to see a little bit in this screen, you can see that we really gave some scenarios around fix it at 75% to 100, and then the 87 in between. In the 15-18 STIP, we essentially had a split of 76 going to fix it, 24 going to enhance. And so that was really where we started the conversation. The 87, I think, was just that happy middle. And that's really, I think, how we'll progress with the conversation again. I think the other in the February, again, one of the things that I think we've learned from the last process was you all really appreciated the engagement with our area commissions on transportation. Even though this just says ACT chairs, it always has included, I think, our advisory chairs as well. Okay, technical difficulties here. And again, this one just talks a little bit more about that sort of continued conversation. We sort of keep, I think, funneling down into how we want to describe the scenarios. And then this one here, what we essentially did after we sort of got to a scenario was we ended up having the conversation about how much would go into non-highway versus any mode. I think what was really interesting that happened in the 15-18 STIP that perhaps we hadn't done in the earlier was sort of recognize that there was a fix-it component to our other modes. So when you think about bus replacement, those types of things, so that was probably something new that came out of that conversation. And I think that really impacted sort of that scenario that you all ended up gaveling down on. It's important to show in this picture, and you can see it in your staff report a little bit better, was we're now not paying any attention, no offense, Highway Division, to the fix-it part. So we've recognized, I think we allocated about 87% of the funds going into fix-it, and then we ended up really just in the scenarios having the conversation about now knowing how much money we were putting into enhance, how would that be divided? So even though you don't see the fix-it conversation in here, as a commission, you dived in a little bit deeper into the enhance conversation. And let's see. Again, so in the off years, you have your workshops often, I think, in November. So this was just sort of circling back to our acts around how, because we were in the proposal process and whatnot, how that was going, and in the Connect process. Actually, those were just being kicked off. That's right. In November, those were just being kicked off. So that was really just engaging once again with our acts with regards to that conversation. And then during that time, we saw different, the FAST Act was passed. You all ended up having a couple of conversations around how to distribute the FAST Act funds. So that brought some modifications to our process. And then ultimately, in December, the release of the draft STIP. One of the things about the release of the draft STIP, in that was a spreadsheet that really highlighted all of the projects that were funded in the categories around the $50 million for highway leverage, the $6 million for the active transportation leverage, and then obviously the enhance. So again, trying to bring that transparency to how those funds were being allocated. I think, so Mary Beth is a horse person, so there you go, that's the picture for that. But we're hoping that everything is on track for your approval in 2017. The other thing that we do have is each of the regions went through, when it was released, the public draft was released, they hold a series of public meetings. And we will have in the staff report that we bring forward next month any changes that came about because of, between the draft and the final. Some of them are pretty minor. They change names or they've done a little scoping and some of the numbers change. Some of them we see a few projects drop off, so we'll be able to highlight those. It takes a while to, from the draft STIP to the final STIP. Making sure, again, scoping, air quality conformity, a lot of things that need to happen before we bring this forward. We've also spent a lot of time with federal highways because of some of the federal regulations that have changed. We really updated the introduction to the STIP. Went through a couple reiterations with that. That becomes really important because federal highways actually has to do a finding of compliance with regards to planning. So for me, the introduction becomes pretty important because without that finding, we'll have some issues with the STIP. So, but I think we're on target with federal highways as well once we submit to them after your approval. So unless I missed anything, Paul or Travis, that you want to add, I'll defer to any questions.
Commissioner Brown, do you have any questions?
No, I tracked this stuff. I got the links finally to work, so I think I'm on board with where we're headed with this. It's sort of, I'm still playing catch up on this phase, I realize, but I'm comfortable with the process we're using. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Commissioner Halloran.
How does it align with the pending legislative package? I mean, is it, when you guys did the maintenance needs and bridges and everything else, I assume that it's largely consistent. Or do we know?
Commissioner O'Halloran, Travis Brower, Odot Assistant Director. The investment strategy that the commission approved was actually based on the funding levels that were built into the 18 to 21 STIP that you had approved in draft form at that point. So we took the amount that had already been allocated to all those programs, looked at the need, and then determined what the delta was, and that was the recommended funding level that was in the investment strategy. Going forward, if the legislature is to pass a funding package before the end of the month or before the end of the session, when we come back to you for the 21 to 24 STIP, we will compare what was included in the investment strategy as the recommended need to what was actually funded. And that will help you then look at perhaps is there a larger delta in some areas relative to others. And that may allow the commission then to ensure that the investments that are made in the STIP are balanced against the investments that are made in the funding package.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much.
I think I don't see Troy. So I think I don't see Troy, so we're punting from this morning, so bear with us just for a moment. And let's go ahead, shall we?
Well, Victor, do we know where Mr. Costalis is? Okay.
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 Should we go to Jay?
Why don't we
Okay.
move? Why don't we move to item J? Just keep
Excellent.
moving.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. And this is engaging in a discussion about the STIP program amendment notification process and thresholds for the commission's approval. In our packet, we have an outline as well for us, and I will go ahead and turn this over to Mr. Lind.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioners. Macklin, Active Transportation Section Manager. So both Paul Mather and Jeff Flowers are here with us today to talk about this. So I'm going to tee it up. We'll have Jeff walk through some more information in your materials and probably be leaning on Paul a bit to provide some context around the project delivery aspects. So we're here today to discuss two related topics. So in your memo, in your cover letter, we've recently made some changes to how we let the public know about changes to the STIP. So following on the discussion you just had, we often find that we need to make adjustments to a 4-year, $2 billion program. And as we do that, we're held to a standard by FHWA and FTA to let the public know that we're making those changes. So we've recently launched a website, there's a link in the letter, that allows the public to see all of those changes, no matter how great or small those may be, on a 2-week cycle. And should we get any substantive public comment on that, we'll address that and potentially have to come back to you if it was maybe something small or what we viewed as small. So that's a public process that we're engaging in. It's online. People can sign up to get notifications as that information is updated every 2 weeks. And there's a quick link to submit a comment. So that's one aspect that we've changed in our process recently to just provide some greater transparency. The second piece is a little bit more challenging, and that's what you all have been contemplating for the last few months around what warrants coming to the commission for approval. What project change really warrants a discussion here or potentially being on the consent calendar of your agenda versus something that the agency can have the authority to approve. So we've recently updated our commission letters, as you know, and I feel, in my opinion, we've really upped our game there and are getting much more thorough letters and supporting documentation about what's going on behind that change. But what we're looking for today is some discussion around what's that threshold that warrants bringing something to the commission. I view it as secondary, whether it's on the consent or the full agenda. From our perspective, doing the staff level work makes no difference what side of the agenda it lands on. The region managers in the room and those watching online know that it takes a tremendous amount of effort to put those together, and it almost doesn't matter, in my opinion, if we're going to sit and have a presentation about it. Obviously, the lens that you all put on it certainly dictates whether we need to have that conversation or not, and that's always up to your discretion. The other thing we challenge ourselves with are the ADA conversation. You just had that agenda item. We're going to see a handful of changes that we're going to need to make as we try to weave those ADA improvements we need to make as part of the settlement agreement into current projects. So how do we think more programmatically about bringing those requests to you all, not individually one-on-one? So as we think about this, one of the challenges we have is really coming down to what that cost threshold is. And that's probably where we'll spend most of our discussion, I would anticipate, around what feels about right coming to the commission. But we're going to need some guidance, or at least a thumbs up from all of you that we've hit the mark or not there. So I'll have Jeff walk through the matrix at a high level to give you some overview of what we're thinking, and then certainly get into some dialogue.
Good afternoon, Jeff Flowers, Program and Funding Services Manager. Is it now?
There you go.
Sorry, Jeff Flowers, Program and Funding Services Manager. So I'm going to walk right through this real quick for you. The first one is just talking about adding and canceling a project or a construction phase of a project. That has always come to the commission. We don't plan on taking that away from the process, as that's just been part of normal business for us. Few little items to note on that, though, is when we go and get funds or we participate on a project such as FLAP or the Federal Lands Access Program, Public Lands, MPO selected projects, the proposal in front of you says that we would ask that the commission would delegate that back down to us just because we're putting in the minimum match to meet the federal selection process from our partners on those. Moving on to number 2, which is the cost change. I'm going to skip that one because that's really the meat and potatoes of this. I'm going to go to number 3, the construction authorization increase. This doesn't change where we're at today as well. Anything that is $500,000 or more comes to you. So what this does do is puts everything on the regular agenda for you guys to see. Number 4 is combining and splitting projects. This strictly talks about when you're taking project 1 and project 2 and putting them together for the same delivery and trying to create those efficiencies for project delivery. If the project adds scope or adds additional cost, it'll get kicked up to one of the other items, which would then trigger whether or not it comes to see you or not. And then the last one is the immediate opportunity funds. Those have always come to the commission, and those will continue to come to the commission per the matrix that we have in front of you. So now, where the meat and potatoes comes in is, what does the commission want to see regarding cost changes? And what threshold is that? The initial take on the matrix is, we followed the construction authorization increase of $500,000 or more would come to you. But I'm going to turn it over to Paul a little bit so he can kind of explain some of the nuances that fall into that and how quickly that can be reached.
Paul Mather, Highway Division Administrator. Having been a region manager for years and having been in front of you in a number of these, have had a lot of experience to see the different size, shape, and texture of some of these ones that we deal with. And this is the most, I guess, difficult one. It's one of those things, I think you know it when you see it, but how do you put that down in expectations from the commission to us as staff to make sure that we are meeting your expectations and bringing things to you? Obviously, the size of our projects are a big issue. If we have a very, very small project and we see the size of overrun is very different than we have a very, very large project and we see the size of overrun. We played around with some percentages. Those became problematic for us. So I guess I'm interested in just hearing more from you. Again, I feel like just from an experience standpoint, I know what you want to see, ones that are maybe on the headline of a newspaper type of thing you want to see, but then there's also ones where we have a very, very large paving project. In our contract, we have escalation amounts that automatically kick in when the price of oil goes up. That can easily, and I've seen several of those during times when we've seen wild volatility in oil prices. We're coming to you all the time with these ones just routine that, we're not at any value to the discussion. It's just the price of oil is driving these things. So how do we separate out those types of things in a way that we're meeting your expectation? We struggled with this one, trying to put some parameters around that.
Well, let me start by saying I think that I appreciate this discussion, and I do believe that strengthening the commission letters really has helped a lot. And I don't know that there will be crystal clarity in terms of black and white. That professional judgment is something that, I as your chair have confidence that if it isn't on the paper, you're going to use your judgment to know what should come before us as well, even if we were to determine a threshold. So starting that as the opening for the conversation, are there other comments that we'd like to add? And I think the hope is that commission members feel that you always have the opportunity to take something off the consent agenda and put it onto the full agenda. But how do we give some sort of guidance and direction as to what those thresholds should be?
Yeah. Madam Chair, just
please.
one more thing I forgot to add. It was just to that
go
point you
ahead.
were making right there. I think the important piece on this matrix is what comes to the commission. Pay less attention to whether it's on the consent or whether it's on the regular item. We can adjust that. But what do you see and what you don't see is the important distinction for us to make sure we get it in front of you in some shape or form. I think is the important direction that we need.
Excellent. Please.
Yep. I would just say I think it's a pretty good crack at trying to get to the heart of the issue, and I think there's going to be an element, to your point, Madam Chair, of subjectivity that when a particular project, and everyone is unique and different, has anomalies, that use your discretion to bring it to our attention. But I think it's a pretty good effort at trying to put a filter on it, but just understand that there's going to be an element of subjectivity in it no matter what, as they're all unique, and and we get it. So, anyway, I applaud the effort. I think it gets at the heart of it and improves process along the way.
Commissioner Brown, do you have comments?
I do, and I thought a lot about this, and I appreciate having this come before us. And I'm sorry I'm not there because I lost track a little bit. I can't always follow on the phone, so if I repeat things, Mac and Paul, I'm sorry. I think there's got to be a way, and I don't know that I have the exact formula, but for a percentage difference on a contract. The main reason I want to see something at the agenda and not just on the consent agenda, and yes, I'm fond of pulling things I don't understand, but I'd like to make sure that we're consistent and that the policies we lay out are being followed, and that we don't overlook something just because it's a big project, and $200,000, $500,000 to a big project is nothing. But for some of these smaller projects and for some of our smaller entities, that makes a big difference. And if we're not following some type of policy that we set out, then we're rubber stamping anything that comes before us. And I definitely don't want to rubber stamp. So somewhere we've got to look at these smaller projects because they're so important and so valuable to some of the smaller communities, and put a percentage on those so that you're not just saying, oh, it's under 200,000, we don't even have to look at it. That could be half a project. So, and I'm probably talking in circles, and I apologize for that, but there's got to be some reason to keep our eye on the ball with these projects. And I know staff's doing that, and I will hold them to it, but that's why I think we need some type of percentage in there. Thank you.
Commissioner Brown, hope we didn't lose her.
Oops, instead of mute, I think we hit the hang up button.
Oh, all right.
Just one moment. Okay,
and maybe
yeah.
as a question for those that are here, I guess I agree with the point she's making. I'm looking for a little bit of help as to
What does that look like?
percentage would be. How would you craft something? We struggled trying to guess what you were interested in and seeing. So a little bit of feedback for us to come back with a proposal I think would be helpful along those lines, because she makes obviously very valid points.
It can be
Please.
or either or, this amount or X percent, So I think you can have it. You can have multiple triggers on what
Okay.
red flags it.
Some sense of 10%, 50%.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be arbitrary no matter what. I defer to
yeah.
Commissioner Brown on what that number ought to be. And I think you've got to have a reasonable amount of flexibility. You're going to have things that you can't control. The engineering says there's rock and you hit sand. And I mean, there's, I think there's, and fuel costs and things like that that are known variables. I think you've got to allow for that ebb and flow. And to execute the project without having to come back to us and ask for approval to move forward. But I think it's just, and probably the bigger the project, the more consequential and likely to rile other interests. But so anyway, I defer to Commissioner Brown on it. But I think you could come up with a proposal that says $500,000 or 25% or something along those lines where it's I don't know, because smaller projects, 25% may be it on a big project. It's like, wow, that's a lot of money. So I don't know. And again, I don't have the answer. It's easier to identify the problem you're trying to solve, but the answer is probably variable. But it does help give more transparency to just where projects are running off, and I think that's the real intent.
Commissioner Lohman, please.
Well, is Paula back yet? She is. Okay.
Yes, I'm back.
Okay, good. Well, I guess I disagree with you on two of the points, Paula. I don't see much difference between having it on consent or on the regular agenda because we can pull it off. And to me, that's a judgment call that's appropriate for management to make. And over time, if we think more of them needs to pull over, we can. I'm concerned frankly, about our time.
Right.
Particularly if this funding package passes. I don't see how we're going to get our work done in a day per month. I think we're looking at 2 days a month, sometimes more. And I think that's a factor that we've got to take into account, not only the commission's time, but also the staff's time. And then with respect to having a percentage, I guess I'm okay with having in either or, kind of either some percentage level or some dollar limit. But I think the percentage on the small projects ought to be fairly high. I mean, we are not managers up here on the commission, and we cannot oversee every single project. And just, again, because we don't have time. So my vote would be on the smaller projects to make it some pretty high percentage, like 50%. Yeah. There's a lot of scrutiny that's going on down at the local level that doesn't need commission scrutiny as well.
Commissioner Lohman, just to elaborate on your time comment, for us it's time too, for us to stop a project, prepare an agenda packet for you, get approval, and then start back up on the project. It can be a minimum of 2 months where that project is then dormant in that decision-making process, and can be 3 months or even longer by the time I go through that. And I understand.
And the cost factor then.
Right, and there's again, I'm not diminishing your responsibility and your want, but just know, as you want more things in front of you, that's a consequence to the project and our ability to deliver those projects in a timely way too.
So Commissioner Lohman, let me ask, so if we were taking them as two separate buckets of decision, one is what should come to us to begin with? I believe that's a question. What threshold should come to us in general?
That's the most important question in my mind, right.
And then the other piece is where it lands. That threshold also is a bit of a discussion item in terms of the complexity or maybe the dollar amount or whatnot or the change. So if we were to take do your comments ring true on both sides of that? And if so, then I think that's a point for us to have discussion on. There is if there's movement from a policy that we have set, clearly that is something that I think from a professional judgment, you would come to us with that. So I think that is the bar first and foremost. And I heard Commissioner Brown mention, tracking to make sure that we are staying within the policies in which we've set. If we're having to deviate from something that we've set in that regard, I would certainly expect that to come our direction.
Right, whether
and
it's
that's
10% or
Right.
$50,000.
Right, so that we are not, one project in Ashland is being provided under a certain set of criteria, and then another project over in Baker. I think that sort of thing we want to make sure is not happening, and that we would leave to your professional judgment and discretion to know that that's either happening or not, and I know today is not. So the next piece would be, what do these thresholds work in terms of coming to the commission, period? And then we work through the change between consent and the formal agenda. Does that follow along with the direction you're looking for?
It is. And I guess one more piece of context for you. Remember, we have performance measures as well, and we'll be going through that as part of the accountabilities in the bill, potentially, as well as the follow-up to the management review. And there could be reporting requirements that you want to put embedded in these to look at, so the ones you aren't seeing, have us report some kind of interval every 6 months, every year. So, now we're seeing a whole bunch of things on here that we wish we would have seen. We need to change some of these thresholds. It's a way for us to report back to you to get a better gauge of how well we're doing as a staff in kind of filtering out the ones that we think you should see or not see. to kind of judge our performance and
Right.
in our judgment on what comes to you or not. So that could be another wrinkle you want to think about in this as well.
Well, and I do appreciate you bringing that up, because in the McKinsey report, it did mention that the tracking of the smaller projects, and I think if we are establishing the key performance metrics as well as maybe even a dashboard of how things are going,
Right.
that allows the commission to be weighing in on, and tracking, no surprises. But it also allows us to have continuity of how we are operating in this regard as well. So please,
And-
Commissioner Lohman.
And you are, I assume, even with those small projects, keeping track of those, you know, how much over budget and how over time, and so that, I take it, would not be, that kind of report that you're talking about, a semi-annual or annual report, would not be a huge new
No.
burden. It would be accumulating data that you've already collected.
Correct. And to my point earlier, keeping velocity of projects going, keeping your time, it would be a way to hold us accountable to those things in a way that still informs how well we're doing as a staff.
That seems like a good compromise
Yeah.
on the smaller,
Yeah.
on the smaller project.
Please, Director Garrett.
Maybe I'm dense,
Okay.
but I want to be intentional. What are we walking away with? Because I think Commissioner O'Halloran actually laid on the table a first iteration we should run through, an either or. And there's nothing that frightens me by just putting a percentage on the table right now at 25%, at $500,000. We can actually backcast and see, well, here's the reality if we take all the projects that came forth. And the majority of our projects are $1 million less. Mr. Flowers, I think I remember that as we kind of scattershot a graph there. And I think we can go to school on that. If indeed we receive an investment infusion from a funding package, again, there's a little time to adjust if we're saying that percentage is wrong here. But I think we need to walk away today with some specifics that we can put on a piece of paper and come back to you. And to the point, we will lean toward bringing things to the commission and the formal agenda. That's my sentiment going into it. I will respect time both of staff and the commission. We will do the due diligence to ensure. But the lean is to bring everything forward here. We now find ourselves at a moment where I think confidence, we need to strengthen that, right? And that plays itself out on many different levels here. So unless there is a fatal flaw in that approach, let's leave today with that exercise, and if we find an issue, we just come back, we've got a new decision point to bring back to the commission. And if that's a comfort level of the commission, that's certainly a comfort level for me, and we will continue our discussions and diagnostics on this until we get it right, whatever that looks like.
Commissioner Brown?
Yeah,
Comments?
Director Garrett, and Chair Bainey, thank you very much. Director Garrett, I think you just hit it on the head there. This is about accountability. This is about us being able to support ODOT staff and for us to be able to never bat an eyelash when somebody asks, why did you do that? Why did you approve something? Why didn't it come forward? Did you just miss it? Whatever. But I think what I'm not trying to manage ODOT, and I appreciate Commissioner Lohman's comments regarding that and regarding time. I, as well as many of you, don't have the time to spend on all of this, but I think it's an accountability issue, and I think we need to make sure that we hold ODOT staff accountable as the director is holding ODOT staff accountable, and that we're doing this for the people of Oregon and not just for one community or another. You know, each one of these projects is meaningful, and if it's not meaningful, we shouldn't be doing them. There are construction standards for the amount of cost adds, and I know that Mr. Mather understands that. And so maybe we ought to be looking at an overall report of where are we with additive change orders? You know, why were they added? Some of these are absolute surprises, just as he brought to us a couple months ago. But I don't think we ought to just whitewash this and say we don't care, because I do care. I care about the money we're spending and that we are applying policy for all of our projects accordingly. So I appreciate what you just said, Director Garrett, and I would like to continue, moving things along and not bringing just menial things to the commission, but let's bring meaningful things to the commission and make sure that we are all holding ourselves accountable. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Brown. So do we, please?
Right, so here's what I heard.
Yes,
I think in
go
the
right ahead.
conversation.
Thank you.
The
Let's make
table
sure we're
we
on the
pre-
same
we-
page.
Yeah, the table we presented, the commission is good with the exception of number 2, cost changes. Under the threshold we bring to the commission, we would bring anything that's $500,000 or greater, or that was an increase of 25% on the project cost.
What are your thoughts on that?
I-
Easy to operationalize, I mean, that,
I think we got to try something
okay.
somewhere. I think that's a great place to start, and I think it gives us direction that we need to.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I do know that you, right now, if there is a unique nuance or something that comes along, that even if it's below that, it comes before us.
Right.
So I would just ask that, if your gut's saying, should I, shouldn't I, we probably lean for a bit on the I should, and
Just like the director said,
Yep.
yeah, we're going to lean into bringing things to you, even if they may fall under some of these thresholds. If we think you need to see them, you will see them.
excellent. Commissioner Lomer?
I guess the only thing I would add is if indeed this additional reporting is slowing projects down, there needs to be a way to categorize that and identify that so that we know that what we're imposing on you is costing projects in terms of dollars and time and how much that is.
Chair Boehne, Commissioner Lohman, if I could just add, I'm sitting here thinking, now that we have a document, we'll update it to Paul's recommendation based on this conversation. I think that's what we would want to bring back to you. If we're hearing frustration of too many things on the agenda, too much time, both from your perspective, potentially your perspective on our time on it, I don't want to downplay Jeff's role. I mean, he's the gatekeeper of this within the agency. So he will be in my office telling me, how much are we getting, and we'll be gauging that. And I think this is the ongoing conversation we can have, especially if a package comes through. But now that we have something documented, I think that gives us the ability to then have that conversation.
What I'd like to offer is, in particular to Mr. Flowers, if we could get on the agenda a check-in, probably 6 months, something that just affords us an opportunity to make sure, and sooner if we've created an issue, but an opportunity for us to check in and see if that, how it's working. And, okay, excellent, please.
My guess is we'll know, because your agenda will be 6 pages long, or we'll be surprising you. And
We won't have an
And we
agenda.
don't want either one of those things, so.
Right,
yeah,
okay.
Right.
So just know we want a balance.
Right.
So please let us know sooner rather than later. So Commissioner Brown, do you have other comments? Okay, so we will go on to.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you, gentlemen, very much. A couple of items from this morning. I'd like to invite Mr. Casales up, and we are going to take up items E1 and E2. And this is the approval of the 2018 Oregon Traffic Safety Performance Plan and the National Priority Safety Plan section application, and authorizing administrator to sign those necessary agreements. But then also we have a bit of a housekeeping cleanup in terms of the action plan defining high-risk rural roads in Oregon as well. So, Victor and Troy, nice to see you both again. Thank you for quickly getting back. I'll turn the floor over to both of you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioners, my name is Troy Costales, Administrator of the Safety Division for the Oregon Department of Transportation.
Victor Hoffer, Chair of the OTSC.
Madam Chair, Commissioners, first item requesting your approval of the 2018 Traffic Safety Performance Plan. This is a document that we do every year. Under federal requirement from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, states and territories put together their review of data, problem identification, performance measures that have come from the long-range strategic plan, which you adopted late last year. So this is the first year where we're bringing that information down into the implementation phase now of how we run our programs on the federal funding side. But with the good graces of our partners of NHTSA in Seattle for Region 10, Oregon is one of the few states in the country that actually shares with everybody all of the funds flowing through the safety program and through the Safety Commission.
So you have 18 different fund sources in that document, of which about 7 or 8 are NHTSA. But what we're trying to share with you and with others is to say, here's what we're trying to put into play related to highway safety matters. This past year, because of the work done on the Strategic Highway Safety Plan, the TSAP, there were items mentioned and discovery of needs in certain topic areas. So during last year's program, and particularly in the document that's before you for approval, there are some significant changes. I'll turn to Chair Hoffer real quick for an explanation of one of those changes.
Well, we recognize that speed is a problem in Oregon and across the country. So what we've done working with the commission is we have earmarked $500,000 for a speed program.
So at the, Madam Chair, at the implementation side, what we're doing is working with, first at the county level, looking at the data to say which of the 36 counties rise to the top with a high percentage and propensity of speed-related crashes that end up in death or injury. Then within the county, are they city streets? Is it county roads, or is it state highways? And then work with those road authorities and their law enforcement that covers those particular road authorities. Is it training? Is it time? Is it equipment? And so we've identified between 14 and 16 specific places around the state this next year where we're targeting those roads where they're showing human behavior related to speed. It's a list that we can share with you if you're interested at a later time, but that's the behind the scenes work from the policy level that the OTSC said, let's attack this strategically, directly, where are the problems, and let's make sure that we make a dent with a little bit of money that we have to put into play. As one example of some changes that were made because of the work of the TSAP and the new objectives and performance measures, I would submit to you the document you see today is probably somewhere between 35 and 40% different than the document you saw 1 year ago when we had done last year's plan because of all of that work over this past couple of years on the strategic plan. So we are directly using performance measures to manage this program within safety. So with that, Madam Chair, be more than happy to answer any questions, but do request your approval of the plan and then the delegation to the person in my position to be able to carry out those agreements in that plan.
Excellent, thank you. Let me check in with Commissioner Brown. Do you have questions?
No questions, thank you.
Okay, Commissioner Lohman.
I have two questions. I like the idea of, spotlighting areas. Maybe we can't do the whole state all at one time, but spotlighting some areas and working on them. But kind of in that regard, on page 31 of the document, or page 37 of the electronic version, there's a table showing death and injury crashes per 1,000 people, per 1,000 population. And I look at Beaverton and Tigard, and it's above 10. Eugene and Bend are at 6.31 and 5.63 respectively. That's quite a difference. Medford is at 9.13 and Ashland is at 3.82. And those are essentially, in the same area. I'm trying to understand why there is such variation.
Madam Chair and Commissioner Lohman, the two data factors that go into that is the population that you've drawn and then what's happening inside that geographic area related to death and injury. Some of the places that you talk about are throughput locations. So they have a lot of travel through there from one end to the other. And so the potential for incidents to occur are inside of that particular area. I'll give you an example. Sherman County doesn't have a lot of population, but they've got I-84 that runs through it.
Yeah.
So on the county level, they rise high because one or two incidents based on that lower population, the rate goes up for them. What we use that as the very first thing, we need to call those jurisdictions. We need to work with those chiefs of police or with the county sheriffs and say, here's how you rank, what's going on, are there some things that we can do from the behavioral side from our office, but are also some things we can do with our partners with Mr. Mather in the highway division and with region managers to say, are there some infrastructure related things that we might be able to put in play from safety corridor or other, but it's the beginning, it's the card that gets you into the dance using that data. It's not the answer, it's the very beginning of the conversation. It lets us be able to target those spots that are of most of need. Some of those areas, like Sherman County, is the easiest one for most people to grasp because of the population being very low, but with a high volume on that interstate. That's what you turn around and find out is then we need to focus on that stretch of interstate because that's where the count's coming from. But you first have the conversation with Sherman County and then keep going down the line. So
Okay, I sort of understand. I still don't understand why Medford and Ashland would be so different, but it may be just the quote, accident of time, Second question concerns the Venn diagram you've got on page 23 of the document, page 29, electronic version, especially as compared with the information on page 106 of the document concerning speed. Maybe I'm reading the Venn diagram wrong, but it looked like out of 134 fatalities, speed was a factor in 135, is the way it looked to me when I tried to add those numbers up. I'm obviously misreading it somehow.
So, Madam Chair, Commissioner Lohman, some of it just has to do with the rounding, because you're dealing in the Venn diagram with 3 years of data.
Yeah.
And we take all of the crashes and first ask the question, how many were speed related? Create a list. How many are impaired related? Create a list. How many are non-safety belt or non-child seat related? And then in each of those databases, connecting between the two or the three, so you see where the overlap is. Then when you do just a straight up data table and you're only dealing with speed related, you'll fluctuate a little bit just because of individual year or in individual averaging, because sometimes with the relationships between the two, in order to make the circles all add up correctly, you're plus or minus one.
Okay.
Again, it's one of those things that's a triage moment for us to say, where should we be focusing? And in years past, that particular Venn diagram very clearly showed inside those three circles, the largest single number was in the speed circle and speed alone. It wasn't alcohol related. It wasn't no belt. They were wearing their belts and they were sober. It was speed and speed alone. And so that in part was led to the earlier comment by Chair Hoffer about the fact that we've got to zero in on that and what do we need to do about it.
Well, that caught my attention. That's the largest single one, but then you see it as a factor with the other causes, and you realize speed is a big deal.
Problem. Yes, it is, sir. Yep.
Thank you.
Other questions? Commissioner Brown, other questions?
Nope, I'm good, thank you.
Okay, so I'd welcome a motion.
Madam Chair, I move the approval of the 2018 Oregon Traffic Safety Performance Plan and National Priority Safety Program application.
And would you also agree to authorize the signature of documents that are necessary?
Absolutely, would amend accordingly. And I assume that we want to do the approval of Transportation Safety Action Plan independently, or do you want to incorporate that into this?
Let's keep them separate.
Okay.
So do we have further discussion? Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
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 All right, motion carries. And next item.
Madam Chair, I move the approval of two minor additions to the Transportation Safety Action Plan to define what consists of high-risk rural roads in Oregon.
Excellent, and the letter to the commission was quite clear on what it is that we are doing. Do we have further discussion? Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
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 Wonderful. Motion carries. And gentlemen, may I just say how fortunate the state of Oregon is to have both of you doing the work that you're doing. Just the conversation we had this morning and then your input and professional interest and dedication to this work is critical to the safety of Oregonians, and I just want to say thank you. So good to see you both. All right, going back to the afternoon agenda, we will move on to item K. And
Brett Hartman.
okay, and I'd like to ask Mr. Hartman to come up, and we have a request to amend the STIP.
Brett's wingman, Mr. Mather.
Excellent, okay.
Chair Boehne and members of the commission, I'm Bert Hartman.
We're just going to rename you. I'll rename you today. Sorry. Please, Mr. Hartman, go right ahead.
Bridge Program Manager. We're here to seek approval for a STIP amendment to add $3 million in funding to the 2017 Major Bridge Maintenance Program. The Major Bridge Maintenance Program is funded at $8.2 million per year through 2018, with an increase of $10 million to year 19 through 21. The wetter than normal winter and spring has resulted in deterioration to pavements, including pavements on bridges. Deterioration includes rutting, potholes, areas where paving is breaking up. These projects provide a safe surface to drive on
And the addition of a waterproofing membrane helps preserve the bridges from damage due to water. Approximately $2 million of this request is to address the most pressing paving needs in Region 2. The Major Bridge Maintenance Program does a mixture of reactive and preventive maintenance. One of the best ways to preserve concrete bridge decks is to apply sealer so the water cannot reach the reinforcement and begin the corrosion process. This request includes $670,000 to seal bridge decks, primarily on Interstate 5 and Region 1. The third project is to repair defects from the original 1958 construction on I-5 bridges in Region 2 near the Santiam River. The ends of the girders did not have reinforcement and had severe deterioration in 2 locations. $175,000 request will provide funding to strengthen the remaining 8 girders that have this poor detail, but have not shown the level of deterioration of the first 2. The remaining $143,000 is to allow for the ability to fund additional work in 2017 without affecting projects that are currently funded.
Questions? I have a kind of elementary in terms of the approaches and decks. If a winter can cause us to a wetter than normal winter or spring, is there a different material we should be using, or is the current process and protocol what you would be doing?
Asphalt isn't something that really protects a bridge deck. In fact, it actually can be harmful to it because the water just stays in it, especially if there's salt in it. But we do have quite a bit of concrete on bridge decks. Concrete itself, we can put a concrete overlay. That's probably a better solution, but it's a lot more expensive. And if you have areas with severe rutting, sometimes it's better just to use asphalt because you can address it easier than to address just with the concrete. In fact, in Region 4, we're thinking about putting asphalt on a concrete deck just because the rutting issues are so bad.
Okay, great, thank you. Please.
So the funding from this for these changes is coming from the cancellation of North Umpqua River Bridge work and the Corp Railroad Bridge. Can you remind me why we're canceling those?
That was a painting project on that bridge, and we have a new corrosion engineer. He said that the paint didn't look that bad, and we can get a few more years out of it. It's in a fairly benign environment, it's not on the coast, so we can get some years out of that and use that money somewhere else.
So that's on the. Oh, I see. This is one project. I thought it was 2 projects. I'm just reading this.
It's one project.
I get it. Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Brown, do you have questions?
No, I went over this a couple of times and have had additional conversation with Travis and Paul Mather earlier, and I have no issues with the agenda item as posed.
Okay, excellent. I would welcome a motion.
Chair, I move to amend the 2015-18 STIP to add funds to the 2017 Major Bridge Maintenance Program
Excellent. Further
in the amount of $3 million.
Sorry, thank you. Other further questions? Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
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 Okay, motion carries. Thank you very much. Good to see you. Okay, next item on the agenda is L, and that's request an approval to amend the 2015-18 STIP to increase funding for Oregon 351, and the dollar amounts are noted on the agenda request. Mr. Sitt, good to see you.
Chair Bainey, members of the commission. Craig Sitt, Region 5, Region Manager of Eastern Oregon. I'm here today to present STIP amendment for the Highway 351 Joseph Wallowa Lake Bike Ped project to increase the project funding from about $2.594 million to $3.28 million. This project will provide a separated bike ped path from the city limits of Joseph to the county park, Wallowa Lake. And in August, you'll get an opportunity to actually see this section when you're visiting us, so that will be good.
Will it be done then? begin so we can ride our bikes on it?
We won't start yet. So, but you'll get to see it before the project actually begins. Willow Lake and the city of Joseph both see heavy tourism during the summer months. We see a lot of conflict with recreational vehicles and bike and ped, and this is a key piece between a short distance between the city of Joseph and Willow Lake, and it definitely will provide a greater safety corridor for this section. Increase in funding request is the result of mitigation factors from the old Chief Joseph gravesite, which is on the National Register of Historic Places. Initial scoping of the project recognized that this site, the sensitivity of this site, and that we work to avoid or minimize the impacts around the gravesite itself. They required consultation with 3 recognized tribes, the Nez Perce, the Confederate Tribes of the Umatilla, and the Chief Joseph Band of the Colville. The project mitigation that increased the project cost, and why I'm here today, is it required some additional design. It required repair and refurbishing of the stone mason wall that was in front of the actual gravesite, which is actually very labor extensive and requires specialty work by a stonemason. Additional retaining walls before and after the gravesite. Our initial design when we looked at it was to just do slope work and not require retaining walls, which is usually more expensive than trying to just do it with earthwork type approach. Some additional signage and ADA requirements. So that kind of why the additional increase from when we originally scoped the project. At this point, I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have regarding this request.
Excellent, thank you. Commissioner Brown, let's start with you. Do you have questions?
No questions. I appreciate that we're looking at the cultural significance of doing this work, and I think it's important to consider that with all projects that we do. So I appreciate that you're doing that, and I realize that there is additional cost. Thank you.
Excellent. Heads nodding in the room. Any other comments or questions on this particular item? Okay, if not, I would welcome a motion.
Madam Chair, I move to amend the 2015-18 STIP to increase funding for the Oregon 351 Joseph to Wallowa Lake Bike Pedestrian Improvement Project.
Okay, further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Excellent, motion carries. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next item, we have a request of approval to adopt the Oregon Administrative Rule as noted, the physical description on the driver's license. And Mr. McClellan, we have a discussion today. Good to see you.
Chair Boehme, members of the Commission, for the record, my name is Tom McClellan. I'm the DMV Administrator. The purpose of me being here is to request your approval of administrative rule involving a sex identifier on driver licenses and ID cards. In June of 2016, Oregon DMV was presented with a court order, a sex change, a fairly common thing for us actually that we receive. We had policies in place to accommodate a sex change on a driver record and a license. And normally a court order provides definitive documentation for the change. But this was something new. The Multnomah County Circuit Court order did not identify the sex of the individual as male or female, but as non-binary. To our knowledge, this was the first court order of its kind in the United States. This set off a series of questions and challenges for us. So I can get this to work. The first question was whether or not we had the legal authority to comply with this court order. We're required by statute to collect an applicant's sex on the application. We're also required to capture a brief description of the person to whom the credential is issued, which for decades is aligned with the American Association of Motor Vehicles, or the AMVA, car design standards, which includes sex. We don't have any statutory language in the vehicle code that limited sex to male or female, however. We were aware of an earlier Jackson County Circuit Court ruling in which the judge had expressed regret that he could not change the petitioner's sex to anything other than male or female. The judge had reached out to other judges across the state and determined that Oregon law only recognized sex as male or female. Obviously, there were differing opinions and interpretation of state law. Although we felt this was a state and perhaps a national issue, DMV was the first place that this individual presented their court order. We accepted that we were the entry point for state government, but thought this may present an opportunity for a broader, statewide legal and policy review. So we asked the Attorney General's office if DMV had the authority to add a third sex identifier to an Oregon driver's license. After a thorough legal review, we were told there were no legal impediments to DMV adding a third sex identifier to comply with a court order. No legal impediments doesn't necessarily mean we have statutory authority, but we did have a court order. We knew this would impact more than DMV. Although our existing process for changing a sex identifier is currently only in policy, we decided to establish requirements that would include a third sex identifier in rule. The formal rulemaking process ensured that stakeholder engagement across the state would happen and provided an opportunity for public comment. We held 2 Rule Advisory Committee meetings in October and December of 2016. Participants included representatives from the Oregon Department of Corrections, Department of Justice, of course, Department of Transportation, State Police, Judicial Department, Secretary of State, Center for Health Statistics, and Basic Rights Oregon. A number of private citizens also attended these meetings, including the individual with the court order and their attorney. Our first meeting focused on information gathering. Advocates for the non-binary community supported either eliminating the sex identifier on the face of the card completely or adding another option for them to choose. We found no opposition from any of the state agencies to adding a third sex indicator. Since elimination of the sex identifier was really beyond our scope, the second meeting focused on the impact of adding a third identifier, which was primarily the need to identify and update systems that share the sex identifier as a data element. System updates are necessary to ensure that the data fields that are currently locked to accept only M or F would recognize and not reject a third character. Because the agencies and systems we interface with may share data elements with agencies and systems beyond DMV's borders, it's not possible for us to identify the full impact of this one character change. But in the end, most agencies decided to implement the change within their existing update schedules and did not identify any concerns if their update lagged the DMV systems to this data field. So they said they would bring it up to standards at some point. DMV has our own system challenges, as you know, and we knew it would require some lead time. We not only needed to reprogram our systems, we had to initiate a contract modification with our card vendor. With no roadblocks identified, we didn't want to delay our ability to comply with the court order any longer than necessary, so we pursued the technical changes in parallel with the rule change. First, however, we had to identify what the additional character would be. The decision to use an X for not specified was actually fairly easy. It was adopted as an option by AMVA, the Motor Vehicle Association, in 2016. It has international acceptance by the International Civil Aviation Organization. It doesn't attempt to classify individuals with an evolving terminology and was supported by our Rules Advisory Committee. At least 8 countries currently issue passports with the option of X in the sex field. In response to a human rights complaint, Ontario, Canada issued their first driver license with an X sex identifier in March of this year. With a technical solution in the works, the next task was to develop the draft rule. Initially, we thought to pattern our new rule after our existing policy for changing a customer's sex identifier, which required the presentation of documents to verify the sex identifier change. We opted instead to draft a rule that allows people to self-certify. It was simple. Our legal advisors liked it. Our customer service representatives are very happy that they may no longer have to verify supporting documentation that they can't realistically verify. It also was consistent with how we collect height and weight data, which is also printed on the face of the credential. Our draft rule went out for public comment in April, and we had 2 public hearings in May, in Eugene and in Portland. The public comments and testimony were overwhelmingly positive. Out of 83 comments, both written and oral, only 12 were opposed to the rule. Most of the 12 opposing comments were things like, "This is ridiculous," "insanity," and "political correctness gone haywire." A city police officer simply stated that if we were taking votes, his vote was no. One comment that provided a practical explanation for opposition pointed out that the purpose of the descriptors on a driver's license is for physical identification, and that a feelings-based descriptor ultimately is unhelpful as a physical description. They suggested if we were going to go that route, the identifier should be eliminated completely. The idea of eliminating the sex identifier completely was also proposed by some of the non-binary advocates, although it was not universally supported within that community. We considered this option earlier, determined it was really outside our scope, but we also realized that other entities like AMVA had it in their card design standards. It's also in the Federal Real ID Act that you will print sex, some sex indicator on the card. There was also a request for additional analysis of the risks to non-binary people associated with national acceptance of the X for a sex identifier. Many commenters acknowledged that having it on their driver's license would not eliminate the challenges they currently face. Some indicated that they would wait until they had a better understanding of the impacts before changing to the X. To summarize the three key elements of the proposed rule: 1, the descriptors on the face of the card remain the same, will have height, weight, and sex. All the descriptors will be self-certified by the individual on their application and can be changed using that same application process. And third, there will be a third sex identifier option. In addition to male or female, individuals will be able to select X for, again, not specified. The testimony provided in support of the new rule provided important insight into some DMV customers that, according to a study quoted by one of the witnesses, are as common as redheads. People didn't share their testimony, they shared their stories. They told us of their struggles so that we'd understand the need. I'd like to share some of the public comments we received in support of the rule. The first one is from an attorney from Corvallis. This is a segment of that letter. I support the Oregon DMV's approach to allowing an X designation in the sex field on driver licenses and identification cards. Not only does this align with standards established by the United Nations International Civil Aviation Association, particularly support the policies that allow self-identification rather than requirements such as a court order or medical verification. Verification presents a significant barrier for many individuals. Not only can obtaining these verifications be time-consuming and expensive, they again subject individuals to the possibility of harassment by uneducated or disrespectful staff. In Benton County, where I practice law, I have successfully petitioned the court on behalf of clients twice for a non-binary designation. However, neither of my clients were able to navigate the process on their own, nor did they have funds available to hire an attorney to represent them. The process is public, requiring public posting and a public hearing, time-consuming and stressful. Despite going through that process, those court orders have been of little practical importance for clients. I appreciate that the DMV has so quickly moved forward to implement this rule so that my clients and other Oregonians who are gender nonconforming can be issued IDs that reflect their gender identity. We received an email comment. Thank you. Although these changes started in the courts, DMV proceeded in a respectful and welcoming manner. While on the website a while ago, I saw the "We're working on it" notice. It was well worded, informative, and considerate. That notice made me smile because someone had taken the time to draft it in a way that showed DMV being careful and considerate. Thank you. The actual solution seems simple and brilliant at the same time. Rather than trying to create an abbreviation for the growing proliferation of gender labels, DMV went with an X. At least for me, it's important not to have the wrong gender label, and this avoids that without requiring me to choose another label. Thank you for making it easy for me. Little along my transition has been easy. A consistent concern we heard throughout the public testimony was how TSA would view an X identifier at airports. Many testified to their experiences going through airport security, and most of the stories are about stress or harassment, but some are just about human interaction. Did you know that the body scanner at the airport requires the TSA agent to select either a pink or a blue button to register you as either male or female before they scan you? One witness shared this story. I stood in the airport scanner, hands over my head. TSA worker number 1 looks me up and down. He looks at his fellow TSA worker for support. He shrugs. She shrugs. Her response, As his fingers hover over pink or blue, pink, blue, I leaned forward and whispered, push pink. Breaks me up every time I read this. Immediate relief on his face and hers. Oh, they say in stereo. And I couldn't tell. I laughed. Yeah, me either. My whole life. Here's one from a high school teacher with the dubious honor of teaching driver education. She described her class of 15-year-olds and their excitement as they anticipated a sacred milestone on the path to adulthood, obtaining a driver's license. She also described the absolute terror of 3 transgender students whose dread of going to the DMV went well beyond taking tests or the usual reasons people don't like going to DMV. The stress of having to fill out an application and face uncomfortable questions has completely overtaken the excitement of achieving this teen rite of passage. There were other concerns about how people would respond to the X and about using it out of state. TSA, again, was a common theme, but law enforcement and even insurance complications were mentioned. Despite their concerns, everyone who testified at the public hearing supported this as a good first step, and they were very proud of their state and appreciative of how DMV has approached the issue. I wish I had more time to share more of the comments. Perhaps there's one that sums up a common sentiment we heard over and over. I'm not asking to be liked. I'm not asking to be understood. All I'm asking is to be treated with respect. If the proposed rule is approved, we're on track for a July 1st implementation. We will be able to issue the first Oregon driver license with an X when DMV field offices open on Monday, July 3rd. Throughout this process, we have been reminded that what we do impacts people's lives. We have not received the normal criticism for not moving faster. We've actually been thanked over and over again for our diligent efforts to keep this moving. If this rule is approved, we will have basically accomplished the change in a year, practically lightning speed, given the complexities of our systems and the significance of the policy decision. I request your approval to adopt Oregon Administrative Rule 735-062-0013.
Mr. McClellan, thank you very much. Commissioner, please.
Thank you, Tom, for your work on this. And I think the issue at hand, and when we request approval on an administrative rule, it just doesn't do it justice. Mm-hmm. And it's fitting that this is before us during Pride Week in Oregon and Pride Month around the country. It's rare that you would say to someone, thank you for suing us. But I think Lambda Legal made a point that would have been nice to get to on our own, and I'm glad we embraced it as we did, as we have embraced this issue. And I hope we can move forward on this, and I hope those who will use X as an identifier will feel an element of comfort moving forward. And I think it is not only something we're doing because we legally, our hand is forced, but it's something that we should do because it's the right thing to do. And I applaud your effort on it, and those who have testified and given their input, and those who have endured it being a challenge previously. So I hope we can put that to rest and move forward. I support this and look forward to voting in favor of it.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Lohman?
I second Commissioner Halloran's comments.
Thank you.
Commissioner Brown?
Yeah, I too agree with Commissioner Halloran, and I applaud the professionalism and dignity that Mr. McClellan provided with his diligent staff work. We often forget that we represent all the people of Oregon, and for this item is such a very important item to a few individuals, and we're allowing them to maintain their respect, their dignity, and I appreciate again, what has been done moving this forward.
I would also like to add that I very much support the comments of my colleagues, and, you know, we are all unique individuals, and life is not easy, and for us to remove any barrier that assists an individual in moving forward, the piece about the less burden on an individual to have to prove that piece just in and of itself, by being able, my driver's license, if you look at it, it states that I'm 5'3", and you know what, I take off my heels and I'm not, and so you know, well, apparently when I was 16 I wanted to be, I'm not sure, but so I'm just being candid about the fact that it should be universal. And I appreciate that the department has decided that you're looking for the path forward with the least resistance. Our job is to serve, and our job is to serve all, and I very much appreciate that approach. So I would welcome a motion.
So, Madam Chair, while this does sound rather administrative, and it is,
Literally.
it really is much more significant than that. And accordingly, I request the approval to adopt Oregon Administrative Rule 735-062-0013, the physical description on driver's license, driver permit, or identification card, sex indicator.
Okay, further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
I
Motion carries. And, you know, we could have taken longer. You know, I appreciate the expediency that we went through, and for the individuals that provided input for us to be where we are today.
Yeah,
So,
and the patience of those individuals as well, as
Yes.
we work through this.
yes, thank you. Great to see you.
Thank you.
All right, moving on to item N, and this is an update prepping us for potentially an action item in July. And this is on the allocation and use of federal congestion mitigation and air quality improvement program funding in Oregon. So, I feel like we may be family. We've been spending so much time together. I'd like to turn it over to Ms. Peets and Mr. Lynn.
Question, just because I know. Question, since I know Commissioner Brown's on the phone, can she see the slides?
I believe she has, do you have, it was in our packet. Commissioner Brown, do you have access to the PowerPoint?
Yes, I'm actually able to see you live and SharePoint and everything else.
Excellent.
And we look good, right? Just kidding. All right, Mr. Lynn, go right ahead.
Yes.
Thank you, Chair Boehne, members of the commission. So, not a topic that is new. I've been in front of this group several times in the last year, certainly talking about the next iteration of where this conversation is going. Amanda Peets has not been at the table with me on this topic, but as we look to transition this into implementation, that's certainly going to be in Amanda's portfolio as we've made some organizational changes. She's working with me, as well as her staff will be implementing this. So we're going to split the time today as we look towards handing this over towards fruition as we move forward.
And may I, before we launch into the presentation, if you are wanting to provide testimony, please check in and make sure that you are on the list in the back so that we can capture that as well. So please, go right ahead.
It's a good point, Chair Boehne. I know there's several members of the Program Advisory Committee that have been helping with us that are here today. There's some testimony already submitted in writing to you, and I know several of them are planning to make comments after our presentation today. So we're not planning to ask for approval today, but we are asking for some specific feedback from you, and you'll see that in our presentation. We'll pause and make note of that. It's also captured in our slides. We've been working this issue for a while. Obviously, we've taken the direction from the commission to take a strategic look at this. That started back in August when we were in Klamath Falls. And of course, in April of this year, we spent considerable time on the background of this issue. So our plan today is to just touch on a few key points there, but really we're going to focus most of our energy on where we're at in terms of the Program Advisory Committee's discussion 2 weeks ago, and where they came together on a recommendation for how to potentially share funding with MPOs. So Amanda will be taking the blunt of that portion of the presentation, and certainly we're going to have some points of discussion in that as well. So our plan is to quickly review the background, walk through the PAC recommendation, pause for your feedback, discuss options for increasing accountability with this model of sharing the funds. I think that's an important aspect we heard last time in front of you. And lastly, discuss any off-the-top allocations, and so we'll get to that as well. I do want to conclude today's conversation with what next steps look like. As Chair Boehne mentioned, we're hoping to bring this back for approval consideration in July, but I'd like to get the read from the Commission at that time. So just a little history, just to refresh your memory, we're talking about $18 million a year. We do have to carve out $250,000 a year for diesel retrofits. That's required by legislation, and that funding gets transferred to DEQ. Then we split funding historically between the MPOs and eligible rural cities, and we'll hit that point again. That's been our history for a long time, and there's a formula around how those funds are distributed, which we've talked about before. Just a refresher on who's eligible, I must apologize for the Middle Rogue MPO and Grants Pass. We have somehow missed them on this map, and I apologize. It's amazing how many times we look at something and we forget the obvious, so our apologies. I would like to point out that much of the discussion today is going to be around the 5 MPOs that you see, of course Middle Rogue being the exception. As well as we'll touch on what about those rural city communities, Lakeview, LeGrand, Klamath Falls, and Oak Ridge. But most of the discussion we're going to get in today is around the MPO piece. So just as a refresher, some of the considerations that went into even launching this conversation, it's been over 25 years since we've had a CMAQ conversation. I think this is an unprecedented conversation in this state, and that's maybe one of the challenges of why this maybe has been so fun to work through. Certainly the leader of this, or the lead indicator of why we're having this conversation, is the confirmed eligibility of Salem and Eugene. It should not be a new issue. The federal performance measures, we've been mentioning that, not sure where they were going to go. Well, they have been approved. So we know that we will have to comply with those and do some reporting. We're still trying to determine, along with FHWA, what the full requirements of that are. But I can tell you it looks like we're going to be setting some targets and considering how we're meeting those targets with these CMAQ funds. So more work to come in that middle lens. And then lastly, your contributions to this conversation of focusing on the strategic. And I think that's the bulk of this PAC's conversation, is what does strategic look like? So lots of meetings, lots of time spent on this. I don't want to lose track of the OTC conversations we've had, but certainly the Program Advisory Committee has been meeting extensively for quite a long period of time each time they assemble, and this is a robust topic to get through. Also pull out that we've had their MPO staff assembled around the table as well, not only because they're experts in this field, but perhaps it's also around full transparency around the calculations and to build better confidence between their policymakers and their staff as well. And then lastly, that rural cities group. For the first time, to what I was told, the first time that we likely had those 4 small cities, LeGrand, Lakeview, Oak Ridge, and Klamath Falls, all in the room together. And they were, I can share their sentiment, they were extremely grateful for the opportunity to engage in that conversation. A refresher of who we've pulled around the table. This is not new, but certainly with some great partnerships around the table that have been helping us through this. There's also a list in your packet as well. Let's just talk briefly about the rural city aspect of this. I think the important takeaway is the PAC recognized that every area should benefit from improved air quality. And so the challenge became, how do we think about funding transportation-related projects in those small communities in relation to the larger MPOs? A completely different scale in the size and complexity of their transportation systems. It's also a challenge that there in these areas, the majority of the source of pollution is from burning or dust. So what can we do from a transportation aspect to help with air quality? And there are things that we can do. I think my classic example is helping with their maintenance activities around street sweeping to control dust, especially in some of those areas that use road cinders during the wintertime. So we're proposing to you as a recommendation that we continue that historic carve out of 3% of the funds to those 4 rural cities, but we change the dynamic of how we work with those funds. We change the program not from a this money moves into an account and builds over time, and then they decide how to use it. We're a little more targeted, especially with the 3 smaller ones. I think this is important if we get a 4th small city, like Prineville we talked about before, maybe on the horizon. Just how do we consider their needs, and also what can we do to help with that efficiency? And lastly, certainly focusing on that transportation nexus is important, and a consideration of all these funds. So with that, we're going to move more into kind of where are we going with the MPOs. I'm going to turn it over to Amanda to talk about the recent PAC conversations and kind of the recommendation that they came up with.
Great. Thanks, Mac, and hello, Commissioners. Good afternoon. For the record, my name is Amanda Peets, Program Implementation and Analysis Manager. So I've been up in front of you in the past as Planning Manager, so now a little different role, and I get to take on this program, among others. So as Mac mentioned, I'll walk through some of the PAC discussions relative to the MPO allocation. So historically, CMAQ funds were distributed to the MPOs via a full formula approach. As we've had conversations with you as a commission, I think we've heard everything on the table from a full competitive program to a part formula, part competitive program. So when we sat down with the committee, we didn't automatically jump to a full formula is the right approach. We kind of talked through each option. Ultimately, the committee favored a full formula approach for a couple of reasons. One, it allows region flexibility so that regions can be opportunistic when things come up, and they can help to leverage other funding sources to fund things. The funding stability offered with a full formula approach also allows them to be a little bit more aggressive in the types of actions that they may be able to pursue to improve air quality within their areas. And so to help guide how we came up with a calculation for that formula distribution, the PAC developed a number of goals, some of which were guided by information from this commission as well. One thing that should be noted about the formula first off is that the historic formula could not be recreated. The data that we had formerly is not available today, so we couldn't use that as a basis. So we were starting over. We decided to interpret that strategic approach as basically wiping the slate clean. So instead of just sitting down and looking at historic allocations and each area going, well, what can you live with, what can you live with, we really started to focus in on what should the considerations of a formula be. Keeping in mind, we want to be consistent with the federal requirements for CMAQ as a base, but also let's put a state lens to this. And then think through what those considerations should be, like risk and effort and some of those types of things. Along with that, there is interest in being less subjective, so trying to use existing data and rely on that. One challenge that we faced throughout the process was that there was good ideas about considerations that we should take into account, but the challenge was how do we quantify those and how do we compare those across areas? So I'll give you an example. There's an idea raised that we take into account all the good work that jurisdictions do and choose to do, such as investing in the pedestrian system. But the challenge is, how do you quantify that? Do you quantify that by their amount of investment? Well, that might be driven because they don't have as much money as they'd want, necessarily. So quantifying that was challenging. And in addition, how do you compare kind of apples and oranges across jurisdictions? So what we tried to do then is narrow in on what I'm going to call source documents. One of those source documents is the state implementation plan. So this is a document that each area develops that documents their commitment to improving air quality. Now, I do want to be clear that this document was not necessarily favored by all participants, but the group basically settled as, well, it's the best available information that we have today to be able to have that source document that we can pull from. So the SIP, Statewide Implementation Plan, was used in assessing level of effort and level of risk. And those are shown on this chart, which we call the apples to apples chart, so that we can compare across areas in terms of what was listed in their SIP. And in addition to those factors, actually first I should note that we didn't just automatically include everything that was listed in the SIPs. So as an example of that, under level of risk and the contingency measures, we tried to only focus on those contingency triggers that were listed in the SIP that best relate to transportation and that may actually occur. So if an area is close to that trigger, let's acknowledge that. So as an example, we really just narrowed in for the Portland metro area on their VMT triggers. So in addition to the statewide implementation plan, we also looked at federal air quality status so that we can acknowledge areas with identified worse air quality issues would get more credit for that. The other thing that we did was created a category under risk called Identified Existing Challenge. This is where we can recognize Rogue Valley's inversion factor, as well as try to get at the congestion part of the congestion mitigation and air quality program. And this is where, as Mac mentioned, we do have federal performance measures now, and that's what we narrowed in on, is that peak hour excessive delay that is one of those performance measures. So those are the factors that we looked at in this chart that led to how we calculated complexity for the various areas. We scored each row on a scale from 1.0 to 2.0. So as an example, Rogue Valley's inversion factor was scored at 2.0, whereas bicycle facilities marked for the Portland area was scored on the other end of that scale. So in total, the complexity score was highest for the Portland metro area, which is kind of evidenced by this chart. The next highest was for the Rogue Valley area, and we had a pretty similar complexity score across Salem-Kaiser, Central Lane, and Middle Road.
That was a lot. Do we need to pause there? Any questions on that part?
I didn't understand the 2X in the metro column for.
Sure. So there's
status.
different. What is the term? I'm blanking on it.
So I was waiting for that question. I was not surprised, Commissioner Loman, you asked that.
Keen eye.
It's around the pollutant types.
Yes.
So for each pollutant, there's generally 3 of them, I think, that we consider in the CMAQ program for each pollutant type, kind of where are they sitting. So that's why you'll see the double X's in Middle Rogue as well as in Metro.
We just approved the use of 1X.
Right. So. All right. Commissioner Brown, do you have questions on this particular part?
The only question that I haven't been able to look at, how old is the SIP?
That varies by region of what was adopted. So we could get you the dates for each area, but once a SIP is created, it basically lasts in perpetuity until it's revised.
And I guess the reason I ask that is when we look at the transportation control measures, I'm very surprised that there are some areas that have nothing. And, you know, like the Rogue Valley has street cleaning and motor vehicle inspection programs, but I know that when the SIP was created, because I started working at the Rogue Valley MPO area before it was formed as an MPO, because I came here in 1993, and transit and bike ped issues were huge, and as far as I knew, were part of the SIP, perhaps not as control measures. So I think some of these, as you stated, we don't all agree, because I do think some of the control measures are not listed appropriately or adequately. So I guess I don't have questions, I just have comments at this point.
And I think you're conveying some of the comments that actually were discussed in the committee meeting as well, so please.
Yes, Commissioner Brent, I was just going to jump in and I would say this is a bulk of a lengthy conversation we've had at the PAC around, that's why we started calling this the apples to apples, because there's activities that these areas do, but they may not be identified as a transportation control measure in their SIP. And to Amanda's point, that's one of the real struggles we had as a PAC was trying to figure out how do you measure these in a quantitative fashion to get to some sort of formula allocation. So not a measure of what activities these areas are doing, but what they're required to do. And I will admit it gets fairly complex and weedy, but I think we had fairly good agreement that we were looking at these in in a way that was comparing it apples to apples.
And we did have each area verify as we walked through the process that those are the correct identified items in the SIP as transportation control measures. Now again, that may not capture some of the other things mentioned in the SIP or things outside of the SIP that the area does, but relying on the SIP as that source document, this is kind of what we stuck with. Okay. If you need me to slow down talking, sometimes I talk fast, let me know too.
I'll do check-ins where I feel like we need to do that, just to make sure that we are not revisiting, we're getting it and adding to it as we go along.
Perfect. So those complexity factors, level of effort, level of risk, and air quality status became part of the formula calculation along with population. And population is viewed as a proxy for the level of impact, particularly as we think about the CMAQ dollars having a statewide effect on air quality. So greater population size, likely greater effect from a statewide perspective. Before I get too much into the proportions that are shown here on this slide, I do want to mention that this slide and the several following it really narrow in on the compromise the Program Advisory Committee reached. So they did review a number of different additive and multiplier scenarios. So ODOT staff sat down one-on-one with MPO staff to walk through the technical details behind that. And as Mac mentioned, we had a meeting 2 weeks ago on June 2nd. We spent 4.5 hours at that meeting just going through each and individual scenario calculation and starting to talk those through. Ultimately, the group kind of coming to a compromise on what I'm going to share with you today. If you have any questions about what all we looked at, feel free to ask those as we go through the process as well. So then narrowing in on that compromise and looking at how these various components of the formula were weighted. The level of impact was weighted most heavily. That's fairly consistent with how many federal investment programs weight that factor, as well as some of our other state programs. And then a 20% weighting towards the complexity that each area faces in terms of level of effort, level of risk, and their air quality status. So in terms of how we actually calculated the formula, again, the 80% on level of impact, 20% on complexity factors. So we went with an additive approach, the level of impacts plus the complexity factors. This additive approach takes into account scale. What I mean by that is that the complexity factor is multiplied by population. So an example is if you're trying to have an effect from a transit investment, it may require purchasing one bus in Middle Rogue, and to have that same effect in an area like Salem, you may need to be purchasing 5 buses. So it's trying to account for that scale different of the effects that you're trying to have in improving air quality. So using that approach, this is how the formula leads to the following percent allocations. 73% for Portland Metro, 9% for Salem Kaiser and Central Lane, 6% for Rogue Valley, and 3% for Middle Rogue. I should note on the 3% for Middle Rogue, what we tried to do is have a minimum for an area that if the calculation factors show below 500,000, that we at least gave them a minimum just for the burden of administering the program and being able to make meaningful investments. We also show here rough amounts. These are rough amounts based on the total amount that we had for the CMAQ program in fiscal year 2016 and are shown for illustrative purposes. As I mentioned previously, we took the approach of wiping the slate clean. So as we were developing the formula, we didn't necessarily look to those historic allocations, but we thought it might be an important data point for discussion when we met with the PAC. And in fact, when we did share this information, one of the points that they raised is, as you look at the information, the Rogue Valley area previously had an allocation of around 14%. Now that's dropped to 6%. So that's a pretty substantial reduction. So the PAC members even discussed, might there be options for lessening their impact, either on a permanent basis or as a phased down approach. So one option that the committee thought about was that the 3 larger MPOs could take a reduction in order to bump Rogue Valley up to something like 8.5%. And then that could potentially be then phased down over a 5-year period down to that 6% that this formula calculates. Again, there was also a question if that should just be a long-term bump up. So I think that's one of the questions before you today. Before I pause for your feedback on the total calculations and this particular question, I just want to reiterate what Mac mentioned earlier. We're not looking for you to gobble down on this. We're not looking for your consensus necessarily on this formula. Your feedback today, your perspectives, and things that can help us as we move forward towards your decision. So with that, I will pause, and then if you have some feedback towards the calculation itself.
I thought you guys liked Amanda. You know, I would say, though, it's awesome to just see your same level of professionalism brought to this issue that you had with the bike ped plan. And this is a very challenging one. And I know a lot of hours have been put in by our chair in particular, and others, and people at the department, the various impacted MPOs and other rural communities. It is incredibly challenging. It's complex. It's emotional. And I applaud you for getting where we are. I don't think that there's an easy answer that makes everybody happy, and which ideally this should be a source of revenue that does assist people in addressing problems, and hopefully that's where it ends up. It's not an entitlement program, and I just want to thank you for the effort that's gone into getting this way and trying to wrestle this one to the ground. It's not easy, and I recognize that. I appreciate you guys doing it because that meant I didn't have to. So, but thank you, and I just wanted to say it's nice to see you on this issue, and Mac as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Brown, I'd like to do a quick check-in. Do you have questions or thoughts at this point?
I'm not sure I do at this point, other than, I think this is a tough process. And like I said, I've been involved with this since 1993, working on developing the SIP. I remember those days and remembering why some things are included and some things aren't. I am concerned with the comments that are made that this has all been consensus-driven and that we reached consensus as the PAC. Especially after reading the letters that were submitted. I'm not sure that's truly the case if you were to ask each member individually. So I know this is tough, and Chair Daney, I know you sat in on all of these meetings and kept things together, and I thank you for that. And I thank members of the PAC for indulging all the interests of each region. And I don't want to be a protectionalist and just protect the interest of the Rogue Valley from where I live, but there are some real issues, and I want to better understand what does strategic mean, what are strategic investments, how did the PAC look at that? So hopefully that will be touched on a little bit, as we go on with this item. Thank you.
So can we touch on strategic, and before we go to Commissioner Lohman's comments, let's touch on Commissioner Brown's?
Yeah, I think the next portion of the slides really get to, okay, once we allocate funds, how do we put that strategic lens to it? Okay. I don't know that we can speak to, and I think in the final presentation when we come back in the staff report, we can speak to how this formula maybe gets to that strategic approach. But certainly we're going to have a lens on it here. And Amanda may have more to add.
Yeah, so what I would say is I think there's two lenses of strategic that we tried to apply. The first is in the formula calculation, starting with wiping the slate clean. What kind of factors should we consider? And I think that's where we start to think about level of impact as a way to think about good use of funds. Also, the formal commitments that areas have to improving air quality, so their level of effort and their risk, and also acknowledging the challenges that some areas have with their current air quality status and trying to account for that. So in that way, we try to think strategically in terms of how do we get the money in the hands of the people that need it? How do we have the biggest statewide impacts on improving air quality? So some of these factors were our attempts at getting there. And then as Mac mentioned, what I'll get into next, we'll talk about once the formula allocation occurs, another way of trying to be a little bit more strategic even with those funds. To address Commissioner Brown's comment relative to consensus.
I'm happy to weigh in on that as well if you'd like.
Okay, if you prefer, sure.
As mentioned by Commissioner Brown, I did attend every meeting, and we do have many members of the PAC that are here, but I also want to call out Susan, who is hidden in the back, who has done yeoman's work as well in terms of getting us to the finish line of presenting this today. So I think we have strong consensus that no one is entirely happy. Matter of fact, I think we could all, do a big high five that everyone is equally anxious, and I think we also have firm consensus that the need for funding in Oregon is great, and the revenue that we have does not match the need. So of those two things, we have firm, hands-down consensus. From there, having participated in each of those meetings, everyone is taking a reduction in funds, and everyone is having to determine what this means for them going forward. And I think we did leave the last meeting saying we don't love it, but this is what we are proposing. And I think today for us, we are hearing from them as individuals versus a statewide. So they were wearing a statewide hat in the room saying, here's what we can do. Don't love it, but we can get out of the room with this and still be friends. But I think they're here as individual entities to say, however, and then provide comment. So there are considerations for us, and I will say that this was a very challenging conversation. There were a couple of times that I will admit that I had actually sent a little note to Mac and said, I think we're going to be out early. I'm not sure that we're going to be able to move forward. This is about as far as we will get. So I'm proud of the work that has been done, but I also want to recognize that there will not be a wow, this we can all really feel great about. And I think that's just naturally the fact that they're advocating for their area as I expect them to. But the needs for us in Oregon are great, and again, the resources, the financial resources today don't match that need. So with the funding package and different things that we're looking at, things could change. And I think it's also important to put on the record that we will be revisiting this. We can come back and take a look. So nothing is in stone, and as we've kind of joked about in Region 1, we're not getting a tattoo today. We are actually moving forward with something that we hope we can at least move on. And this begins in 19. This does not change today's funding allocation either. So those are my comments. This has been challenging, but folks are still, they showed up. Please. Oh, Commissioner Lohman.
Did you have more to finish?
No, I think the only other thing I would add to what Commissioner Bainey already covered is that as she mentioned, there were a couple times in the meetings where we all said, well, are we done? Should we walk out of the room? Because we're all saying that these are not acceptable. And I have to applaud the work of the Program Advisory Committee and those members for coming back together and saying, no, we think we can work through this. And so I like to refer to this as the compromise. I think Commissioner Bainey put a good point on it, is nobody was happy. I think Mr. Jaffe even pointed out, this is nobody's first choice. As you go down the list, it's maybe the middle of the pack for most people in the committee. And so that's kind of why we settled on this that we're presenting today. And I think what would be helpful, and we can go ahead and proceed through the rest of the presentation, but if there are significant concerns or alternative ways that you'd like us to consider how we do this calculation, that would help us when we come back to you the next time. So we appreciate any feedback you have relative to that.
Feel free, go ahead.
Okay, I don't have any modifications to suggest today. I want to think about it, so I want to kind of reserve my, keep my powder dry. But I do want to say, to me, this is a fine example of good government. It is a wicked, wicked problem, as everybody has pointed out. There is no solution that's going to satisfy people fully, maybe even 70%. But you've taken the problems seriously. You've listened. The PAC did, and the department did. Staff did. Listened to the real concerns of all the areas involved, and come up with something that is not sweet, but it's swallowable. And I, as the chair said, I think it is something to be proud of, even though it kind of hurts. And I know from my area, from the Rogue Valley, obviously this is something very important economically. I mean, it really does mean if they can't get a handle on air attainment, that means no significant economic development in the area. That's big. That's really big. So you can understand why they feel very strongly about it. It's more than just clean air in a way. It's livelihoods that we're talking about. So I do think that part of it, I mean, this is $18 million. In the scheme of things, that we have to deal with in the transportation arena, it's not very much money at all. And part of the issue here, really underlying issue, is that money for transportation keeps coming to us in silos. And this happens to be a particular silo that is important to a lot of people, but if we were thinking about the broader transportation picture, I think we'd say, well, surely there's a to take care of some of these issues through another source other than CMAQ funding. And indeed, with the new transportation funding package, knock on wood, the funding for transit may help smooth over this problem to some degree. I know that the Rogue Valley has spent a fair amount of its CMAQ money on helping RVTD survive. And that is obviously very important to our area. It's a skeletal program at best, and it's been on the verge of not surviving. So that CMAQ money has been critical to the transit part of the transportation system down there. Maybe with some additional money overall, that looks like maybe in this package, maybe this will be a little more swallowable. But I do hope, and I haven't seen your next slides, but I do hope as we go forward, we're able to look at this again, and that we're able to take into account the hits that some people are taking in the CMAQ program, and find little ways to offset that as we deal with some other program money as well, especially since hopefully we're going to have more of it. So I guess I just want to end by saying I do think this is a compromise to be proud of. It isn't imposed by some, figure from above. It's all of us trying to find a reasonable way through a very dense thicket. Thanks.
Okay, shall we go ahead with the final of the presentation, and then I'll check in with Commissioner Brown on the phone as well.
Sure. So I think getting back to Commissioner Brown's question again about that strategic lens, one of the things that we entertained was once that formula allocation occurs, so we've done the calculations, distributed to the various areas, how do we apply another lens to make sure that you as a commission and we as a state feel that the CMAQ funds are being spent to the highest priority things and aligned with our state goals and interests. So historically, that allocation was made and the local jurisdictions had full discretion on how to spend that money. Recognize you may have interest in a more accountable approach to that. ODOT staff came up with a few ideas which are provided here. We had a brief opportunity to talk about it with the Program Advisory Committee, however did not have a lot of time to spend with them on this particular topic. I think certainly interested in your feedback today on where your interest lies. So the first approach I'll walk through is what we've termed a performance-based approach. So the MPO would have full discretion to pick the projects that they think are needed, and there is a list of eligible CMAQ projects according to the federal program design, and that the MPO then would produce some kind of report or document that talks about how those projects they selected benefit key statewide goals for Oregon. So this is kind of how we can apply that Oregon lens to the CMAQ formula, so still being consistent with the federal requirements, but putting that lens on. So what we've recommended up here for state goals are what's in the plans that you have adopted previously, and those that we thought might closely align with air quality. So environmental sustainability, health, and equity. So that's one option. Another is using those same state goals to help filter the list of eligible CMAQ projects. So instead of having a list of, I'm going to make up a number here, but 30 eligible CMAQ projects, we narrow that down to 15 that we think best align with our state goals, with our statewide policy, and that get Oregon where we want to get it. Then the MPO would have full discretion to pick from that narrowed list of projects. So what's shown here is just an example list. Many of these things like ITS, tolling, transportation options are things that many of the MPO areas have chosen to fund with CMAQ funding. There's a few things removed from this list. And as another example, traffic flow is listed. Today, you can make traffic flow improvements with CMAQ money, including adding a left turn lane. But you're allowed to add a left turn lane to a road that may not exist yet. You're trying to be proactive about that. But does that really help air quality? So we could put a refinement on that by saying, yes, that's an allowable use of CMAQ funds, but only in congested conditions where that's going to equal an actual air quality improvement immediately. The last option that we came up with, but there may be others that you can think of, is a targeted approach. So this would be more on the heavy-handed side of directing the CMAQ money. So you could come up with, once that allocation is made, targeting a portion of that towards specific investments that you think are really important. So in this example, targeting 20% of the funds that an MPO area gets. And in this example, half maybe to transportation options investments, the other half towards vehicle efficiency, like buying electric buses, for example. Then on the remaining proportion of funds, the MPO would have full discretion on how to pick their projects. So I'll pause there to see, I guess, one, interest in increased accountability beyond just full local discretion on how to spend the money, and that if any of these options resonate with you or if you have concerns towards any of those.
Let me check with Commissioner Brown first. Commissioner, do you have comments on this particular part?
I think you're asking me, and I don't have specific comments on this. Thank you.
Okay, other commission members? Please.
Well, this is, I really haven't thought about this, so this is off the top of my head, but the bottom one, the part local discretion, in effect creating mini silos within the silo, to me, is asking us to make judgments that I don't feel competent to make, and it's just slicing this into too many small pieces. So I'm not really keen on that one. I kind of need to think about the other two. My leaning, I guess, would be for the narrowed list of eligible projects. Because I can look at some projects, some of these CMAQ projects, and say, whoa, what did that really contribute to the state's air quality or even the region's air quality. But I think it's a good discussion for next time after we've had time to think about this.
Please. Oh,
May I
Director
ask
Garrett.
just a question? How was equity defined?
In terms of looking at the state goal back there, so according to our statewide plans, so I could use the bicycle and pedestrian plan as an example. So it's not thinking about geographic equity, it's thinking about reaching transportation disadvantaged populations, making sure that in some ways we're prioritizing investments in those areas that may not have other options. So with CMAQ funds, bicycle and pedestrian investments, maybe kind of targeting some of those areas. So that's a way in which we could apply that statewide goal lens towards maybe that narrowed list of eligible projects.
If I could just add, Commissioners, so in the PAC conversations, the brief discussion we did get to have with them about this, I think there was recognition that many of the MPOs are doing this. They're already looking at maybe what their performance of these funds is getting them. And if you recall back in August when we started this conversation, there was a specific nod from this group, this commission, around what our role needs to be. So Commissioner Lohman, I appreciate your comment, because this is often a case of what is our resource ability to engage in this. And I think that top dashed box is where we've been in the past, and I use the term we've been very passive. And I think we will need to do one of those three based on, I think, the conversations we've had up to this point. And I don't feel like the top one or even the second one down is a big change, maybe from what some of our partners are already doing today. It's putting a bit finer point on it.
So the last point of discussion is off the top allocation or considerations. As Mac mentioned earlier, there is a state statute that requires that we carve an amount, $250,000 off the top for diesel retrofit. During the PAC conversations, there was a question raised by Portland if their requirement for greenhouse gases should be a consideration in the formula. Ultimately, the group decided to divorce that from the actual formula calculation and send that to the commission for consideration as an off-the-top allocation. So I'm not going to get into that too much. I think that's up to Portland to have that discussion with you, and I'm sure they're here to testify and present on that issue. But beyond that, if there's any other off-the-top or other considerations, my guess from Commissioner Lohman's earlier comments are let's be careful not dividing that pot too much. But if you do have any thoughts or considerations relative to an off-the-top, we'd be happy to hear those.
Is there a point where the diesel retrofit is no longer needed, where everything's been retrofitted and it has new standards?
Commissioner O'Halloran, it's a great question. I'm not the expert to be able to answer that, but I think that did come up in the PAC conversations around both diesel retrofits as well as vehicle inspections, the DEQ vehicle inspections. I know there was quite a bit of discussion around that. It's not controlled by us, but certainly that was part of the conversation. And that specific set aside would have to be taken up with legislation to remove that, but that was brought up.
I'm sorry, but I don't think I understand this graphic yet, particularly the bottom half. So it is, can you just kind of walk me through it?
Sure. So the top part is the total allocation, and then really trying to put diesel retrofit first as an off the top. So before any formula calculation occurs, a proportion goes to diesel retrofit. Then after that, how is that money distributed to the MPOs in the rural cities? I think I pulled this graphic from the earlier one, which was the historic. So I think this formula dashed line is pending a decision on how that's allocated.
I see.
And we would, Commissioner Lohman, we're advocating or recommending for that 3% for the rural cities and 97% for the MPOs.
Right.
And then this question of what about the Metro GHG requirement, and should that be considered or not?
So as was mentioned earlier, in terms of timeline, the graphic faded out a little bit, but today We actually made more progress than we had originally anticipated at the June 2nd meeting. So today we wound up presenting you kind of everything that the PAC had discussed. With an opportunity and acknowledgement, we contacted our PAC members and said, hey, we're going to be presenting on everything. If you have comments, please send those to the commission. So I know you have a number of letters in your packet. There's several of our committee members here today to testify after we leave. And then offering that opportunity through July if that's the time frame that you think makes sense to make a decision. With that, I'd be happy to take questions. I would like to reiterate Commissioner Bainey's acknowledgement of Susan Peichman in the audience. On my staff, she's done a lot of the heavy lifting of this and a lot of work, so really appreciate her time. Commissioner Bainey, really appreciate your leadership on this and helping us through those difficult conversations. And again, our sincere appreciation to the staff and the Program Advisory Committee members. They spent a lot of time going with us through this. It's very complicated information. They dove down in the details with us, came up to the high level with us, and had a lot of conversations, so really appreciate their efforts as well.
Okay. Do commission members have any questions for the team before we move on to public comment? Okay. Commissioner Brown?
It's real hard to not be in the room and talk through this. I'd like to hear from those that PAC members, if they are going to speak, because I think we really need to look at statewide significance for air quality. I realize the implications from Portland and all of the congestion relief measures that they're working on. But I do think that the rest of the state has air quality issues. I know in the Rogue Valley they struggled to reach attainment and get into a maintenance plan. And so with their maintenance plan, they still struggle because of the basin they're in. I know other areas within Oregon are in the same position. And I'm concerned. I need to work through the CMAQ allocations because I am concerned that we're not doing due diligence throughout the state. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Could we go back to the slide where we took into account the airshed and the basin criticalness? I'll turn it over to either of you.
Sure. So, turn my microphone back on. So the way that we considered air quality issues was through what's listed as status on this chart. So it takes the official federal designation for each area of their air quality status. So non-attainment all the way to attainment, and then there's different levels of attainment. Attainment with a maintenance plan, attainment with a limited maintenance plan. As Mac mentioned, there are different there's three different, why do I keep blanking on this word?
Should I bail you out? Pollutants.
Pollutants, thank you. That are counted that may fall in these various categories. And so, as you can see, the Portland metro area has 2 X's for attainment, so they did not get any points for that. Whereas other areas like Rogue Valley that have attainment with a maintenance plan have the higher end of the scores that we evaluated. And then the other way, particular to the Rogue Valley, that we recognized is the inversion factor discussed in their SIP and also presented by staff and discussed, and that received the highest level of points available for that issue as well.
So we may still not get to agreement, but I wanted to make sure that we covered that again. So would you be on standby during public comment and be prepared to help walk us through the decisions that you need in terms of direction, the fine points of what you need from us today? And then I do have, in your packet, you have letters from RVMPO, Salem Kaiser. We also have Federal Highways letter, Metro as well. And then I have 4 individuals that are signed up for public comment. If anyone is interested after these 4 individuals, please just raise your hand or holler out and let me know. Mayor Clark, let's start with you. Oh, and Mike Jaffe, if you want to, sure, go right ahead. Nice to see you both.
Okay, now it's on.
Yes.
Thank you, Chair Bainey, members of the commission and staff. My name is Kathy Clark. I'm the mayor of Kaiser, and I chair the Salem-Kaiser MPO. I was a member of the team that worked on this compromise, and a tremendous amount of work was put in. I don't think that can be possibly overstated, the kinds of conversations that needed to happen. Mike was absolutely instrumental in helping with data and understanding the history and the where we are landing now in this conversation going forward. I think the comment was well said that this is not anybody's first choice, but that's kind of going to be what happens with any sort of transportation package. We are all in a place where none of us have enough money to complete the plans that we have already adopted, that have already been through rigorous review on the local and state level, and where required the federal level. We already have projects that are prioritized. We have already looked at environmental justice and equity. For example, within the Salem-Kaiser area, we have really focused our transit and our bike ped programs and projects in areas that are underserved, recognizing that we have to provide multimodal accessibility for all members of our community. The CMAQ dollars are going to be important for helping move some of these projects forward. We have already been doing bike ped, transit, and so forth. Because we haven't been getting CMAQ doesn't mean we didn't do them. We have the same values, we have the same requirements under the state, and more importantly, we have the same responsibilities to the members of our community to provide multimodal, complete systems. The CMAQ dollars, like every other transportation dollars, they have strings attached, and we recognize that, and we are well equipped to be able to demonstrate the projects that need to be done and how they comply with CMAQ goals and objectives. In addition, we can also demonstrate that those projects would have co-benefits. For example, greenhouse gas was mentioned. When you clean up the other pollutants from the air, one of the co-benefits is greenhouse gas, and other issues that arise from incomplete or inefficient systems of transportation. One of the reasons that when the whole issue of greenhouse gas was raised during our meetings, that I felt that that was not a great add-on is A, that is not a requirement under CMAQ, so we can't make the complete nexus to that. But more importantly, we recognize that it is a co-benefit. This might be an opportunity for leveraging these dollars with other projects that would actually address greenhouse gas, but that comes from another pot of money. This is particularly targeted toward these particular pollutants. Greenhouse gas is an addition, and there's probably there is a rational nexus between the benefits of CMAQ projects and reduction in greenhouse gas. But I would urge us to make sure that as we are looking at funding, to keep targeted on these projects and look for opportunities to leverage, to get co-benefit, or to look at other funding sources. Again, we have very few pots of money to pull from. We are getting the best bang for the buck we can, and if we're going to address greenhouse gas, which is a state mandate, not federal, then I would urge us to find state dollars to leverage to go along with these dollars, and see if we can get some mileage, so to speak, out of those. I would also like to acknowledge that this was indeed a compromise. People came prepared to protect our areas, to look for opportunities for funding our projects, and to make sure that we could get the projects we know need to get done can get funded. But we're all willing to sit down and work together. And I think a lot of this has to go back to 10 years of Umpqua, the Oregon Municipal Planning Organizations Consortium. Over 10 years ago, MPOs began to sit down and get to know each other and find out what we were dealing with. And we found out that we had a lot more in common than not in common. We have the same issues of air quality, of complete transportation systems, funding, et cetera. And it was important for us to come to that understanding so we could work together and not in opposition. I think that hashing through this probably would not have happened without that background of common understanding. Finally, I want to address a couple of things. One was talking about some of the complexity factors that were mentioned. The SIP and other things, thank you for noticing that there were some blanks in there under, obviously, that we're doing similar projects, but because they're not identified in one document doesn't mean they're not happening, and that they're not happening under the state regulations that govern our transportation system plans. So just, I also want to reiterate that Kaiser approves or supports, or Salem Kaiser does, the two-way option. It's a good compromise. It's a good place to start. We can talk about the ways that we can report out to demonstrate to the taxpayers who ultimately own our systems and the money that we are using it responsibly and making sure that we are creating systems that work for everybody. Thank you very much, and I'll entertain any questions.
Thank you, Mayor Clark. Do we have questions? Question? Commissioner Brown, do you have questions for Mayor Clark?
No, I appreciate very much your statements. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Jaffe.
Thank you, Commissioners, and Chair Bainey, especially for going through this very long process that you went through to chair the committee. Just want to first say that, bottom line, every area wants to do good projects with these funds, and I think that's something we all recognize of each other. Mayor Clark mentioned that we've gotten to know each other over the years, and we know good things are being done with these funds. So, number one, we know that. Now, it was a bit of a rough road to get through this process. We had contentious discussions and arguments. We always didn't see eye to eye, but we were respectful of each other, and we knew we wanted to come to a compromise. So my letter goes into a number of things that SCATS thought was maybe important points for the Commission to recognize as part of the discussion. Some points that we didn't think were maybe quite settled, but we recognize that everyone's going to have a different opinion, that we need to get through this process and, as Amanda said, come up with the compromise. So we did have some reservations about the SIP, as was discussed by Mac and Amanda. It is a really old document. There are things that have expired in that document or have been changed over the years. It's to our mind not the optimum lens to do this process, but we understand Metro was very in favor of this process. We try to meet that halfway, and I think the staff's recommendation that 80% be done by population is a fair one going forward, at least for the next several years as we do this work or do this allocation. And I think next time we go through this, we will have a lot more experience. I know I will have a lot more experience. I've learned so much going through this process. On the greenhouse gases, as Mayor Clark says, at the moment we don't support a set-aside for a number of reasons. First, as everyone knows, the CMAQ funds are in short supply. They're already pretty stretched out. So to ask for off the top stretches it out even more. The other thing is, as far as federal regulations, as I read them, greenhouse gases is only to be considered as an ancillary benefit. So if you're picking projects for greenhouse gases, you can't pick a project to say it'll just reduce greenhouse gases. It has to be a project that reduces the criteria pollutants, the CO, and the precursors of ozone. GHG is only an ancillary benefit, not something you pick a project to do. And lastly, any projects that gets funded by this, if it improves CO, it'll also improve greenhouse gases. It's the same emissions coming out of the same tailpipes. So if you're taking off 10 miles of driving, you're also reducing greenhouse gases and CO and ozone. So you're doing all those things simultaneously. It doesn't seem appropriate to have a special set aside to do more greenhouse gases than the current allocation. So to sum up, we found that the option 2A was livable with for now, and that we recommend against any kind of set aside for, especially for greenhouse gases. The committee really didn't have an opportunity to discuss that at length as far as what kind of set aside. Is it greenhouse gases? Is it transportation options? There's lots of state goals out there. How much and the purpose. So I'll take any questions if you have.
Thank you. Do we have questions? Commissioner Brown?
No questions, thank you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you both. Next, I have Mayor Lundberg.
Chair Boehne, and members of the Oregon Transportation Commission. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I am Christine Lundberg, the Mayor of Springfield, Oregon, and I am before you today as the Chair of the Central Lane MPO, and as that MPO's representative on the CMAQ Program Advisory Committee. As you know, the committee's charge was to develop a recommendation to you regarding a fair and equitable distribution of CMAQ funds now that the Central Lane MPO and Salem-Keizer MPO have been included by Odot as CMAQ eligible MPOs. And I want to stop for just a minute because I had a conversation with Counselor Mike Quilty, who was also on the CMAQ PAC, and unfortunately had to be in California. They had a death in the family, but we spoke before just a couple of days ago, and the conversation we had, I want to say what I'm going to read, he would be in agreement with because we had a conversation about that. And I think over the course of this PAC that we have become friends. So, the tremendous challenge before the committee, of course, was how to fairly redistribute a relatively fixed pot of money to a group of CMAQ eligible MPOs that has now grown to include the state's second and third largest metropolitan areas. On the one hand, none of the existing recipient MPOs was particularly motivated to reduce their funding to equitably fund Central Lane and Salem-Keizer. On the other hand, Salem-Keizer and Central Lane qualify for this funding on equal footing with the MPOs who have been receiving CMAQ dollars. Because of this conundrum, discussions at the committee about how to make this funding transition were difficult to say the least. Oregon and our cities and counties are in the midst of a transportation funding crisis, and therefore any resource available to the system, in this case for air quality improvements, is naturally going to be guarded closely. With this in mind, it is a credit to the MPO leadership, ODOT support, Chair Boehne for chairing the PAC, and process facilitation that the group was able to reach consensus on this difficult question, agreeing to a formula that all could live with for funding to be put in place in 2019. Over 10 different scenarios were developed, analyzed, and discussed with vigor among the committee members. Once reached, there was an expectation that the consensus would be honored by the CMAQ Advisory Committee and seriously considered by the OTC. That is why we were surprised to see the third to last slide in the CMAQ funding update PowerPoint posted as agenda material for today's discussion introduce a new element, the Metro G greenhouse gas requirement. This was discussed and not supported by the CMAQ Advisory Committee and not included as an element of the consensus agreement. It is very important to me and to the two new MPOs in the group, and I might add part of the discussion I had with Counselor Mike Quilty when we were on the phone about this particular allocation or off-the-top allotment. There was many hard work that was put in by the committee members and their agencies to reach a compromise that all could live with, which is carried forward by the OTC. Under the consensus agreement 2A, Portland Metro continues to receive over 70% of the funding, with Salem, Keizer, Central Lane, Rogue Valley, and Middle Rogue sharing the balance of less than 30% of the dollars. I remain hopeful that each MPO will honor the integrity of the recently completed process and that the Oregon Transportation Commission will respect the level of effort and compromise that was produced the committee's recommendation to you. And as somebody who started my career as a counselor in 1999 and did Beltline I-5 as my very first project, I have seen the amount of effort it can take to get to completion and actually have everyone, I believe we clapped when we got to the end of the day. So again, Chair Boehne, I thank you so much for working with us, but I think that the compromise that we reached and the agreement that we walked out with was a good one, and that we would hope very much that you take that into consideration as you work through the rest of the process. And thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Do we have questions? No? Okay. Mr. Thompson, will you be?
No, thank you, Chair Boehne, Commissioners. I'm Paul Thompson, Manager of the Central Lane MPO, and as at the PAC, I'm only here in case there were questions that the Mayor wanted to defer to me to respond to.
Okay. And I do want to underscore that the greenhouse gas discussion was not part of the consensus that we came forward with. So that distinction is an important one, and I appreciate you putting that on the record. And great to see you both, and thank you for your commitment of time as well.
Thank you.
Okay, and I believe Ted Liebold, we have you as the last signed up. Please, Ted, great to see you. And anyone else who's interested in approaching the commission on this item? Okay, so
great. Thank
the
you.
floor is yours. Nice to see you.
Thank you, Chair Boehne, members of the commission. My name is, for the record, Ted Liebold, Planning Manager with Metro, the Metropolitan Planning Organization for the Portland area. We really appreciate the Commission's direction to deploy the CMAQ fund strategically to produce the best outcomes for the state in terms of the state goals. And we think that the work of Odot staff and the PAC that you put together really has honored this direction in terms of coming up with the recommendations to date. While we still have concerns that the final formula will have in terms of its impact on us to be able to fully meet the commitments we have in terms of both to air quality and the impacts that might have on the economic development in our region, we do really appreciate the process and the outcomes to date. Part of the outcomes that we think are strategic includes this formula framework that the PAC has agreed to, and we believe can be strategic and support the areas that have committed to implementing transportation projects that reduce emissions, to meet our air quality plans, to address the unique risks associated with each area in not meeting those commitments or in meeting their emission budgets. Yet, the formula also addresses the political needs of each region as well and strikes a good balance. However, the final details of this agreement have not been reached yet, and so and those final details could have a significant impact on how closely the agreement does meet the OTC's direction to be strategic. And so our region is committed to continuing to work with ODOT staff, the other CMAQ eligible areas, to make sure that we're all comfortable with the final outcome. So the nexus between air quality and transportation and CMAQ funding is a complex topic. I won't dive into the technical details of our particular region, but just know that we do support the compromise the PAC has agreed to date. And I am available to respond to any questions you have about our region, about our status of our region on these topics. That said, there are two additional issues I think that are still under consideration. One is the greenhouse gas emission efforts that our region has as a unique requirement to both produce and enact a plan that will meet greenhouse gas emission targets that were set in state legislation with the Jobs and Transportation Act. Early in the process, the group agreed to essentially not consider it as part of the formula, but to essentially forward this issue to you for your consideration. This issue is still an important issue to our region as it represents a significant increased obligation on our region to fund particular transportation related projects to reduce the emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. And while we're open to further discussion with the Commission and the PAC about whether this can be addressed either through the CMAQ allocation or through funds outside of the CMAQ program, but it is still an important issue for us that we've essentially had this requirement placed on us. We have developed a plan on how we can do it, but we have a lot of obligations now to be able to implement that plan that we are obligated to implement. The second issue is bridge funding for the Rogue Valley. As you can see from the formula, the draft formula numbers that were presented by ODOT staff, this represents reductions to not only us, but also a significant reduction to Rogue Valley. And we just wanted to be on the record that we do support a phase-in adjustment for the Rogue Valley that this new formula will represent to them. And so we want to continue to work with you and the PAC to be able to make this transition work. I didn't dive into a lot of details. If there are questions about our greenhouse gas requirements, that was raised as an issue here. I'm also happy to respond to any questions. So with that, again, I just wanted to thank the Commission and ODOT staff and the rest of the PAC and MPO staff members for their work on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have questions? No? Commissioner Brown?
I have no comments. I appreciate what he's saying, and everyone's echoing the compromise versus consensus. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Please.
Thank you. So we appreciate all the comments that were made today, and
Apparently I didn't. Sorry.
so maybe what might be appropriate is to consider next steps to this issue. So in hearing the conversation today, some of the questions that have been raised, I think in particular, Commissioner Brown mentioning wanting to understand a little bit more of the technical details and what was worked through. What Mac and I were just talking about is perhaps in between now and the next OTC meeting, we're currently working on a detailed staff report that walks through everything that the committee considered, the different alternatives, and kind of the technical background behind things that can give a little bit deeper dive than we were able to spend today doing. We can post that to our website. So we've been posting all information on CMAQ to a program advisory committee website that's public and open to the public. So that way you as commissioners would have the opportunity to see that, but our fellow program advisory committee members and other members of the public could see that documentation as well to help inform a conversation then coming back in July. And I think the question would be, what point might you feel comfortable in considering an action then, or at least open it up for discussion and potentially playing that by ear, but I defer certainly to you on how you prefer to proceed.
Just to clarify, what action do we need to take to ratify this moving forward? I mean, you have a delicate compromise. What needs to be done?
I think we have some please, Mac, go ahead.
Yes, so Commissioner Holleran, so we will need the OTC to take action on an approach for sharing or distributing the CMAQ funds. So that's not what we're doing today. Right. So we'll be prepared to bring that back to you at some point for you to take an action on it. And what we're doing today is gathering that information and feedback from you to say, if there's a fork in the road that you want us to take on a couple of these issues, great, and we'll do that. And then the staff report hopefully helps articulate that position.
So just to put a little bit finer point on that, so I think that items of action are to agree on what the allocation looks like to the small jurisdictions. So what was proposed is that 3% carve out and kind of that approach. Then looking at the MPO formula calculations and how that played out to determine if you want to have any adjustments for any of the areas such as Rogue Valley. I think determining that accountability mechanism. So we received some comments from you today. We can bring back a proposal of what that might look like. And then any other considerations that you would like to make on the formula as a whole based on conversations today or otherwise.
Great.
So, yes. Madam Chair, I think from a timeline, I mean, there's a delicate compromise in place, and I don't know that there's a risk of it unraveling. I don't know, but it seems to me like we would want to allow people to plan on that happening sooner rather than later. And I realize not everyone's happy, and it's a reduction in funds, and Portland had a lot to lose in it as well. So I think that if I mean, this has been crafted through your hard work and effort and a lot of, I think a lot of people having a willingness to modify their positions and be flexible to try to get to an agreement. I'm just asking, what is it we can do to move forward and kind of take action on this, and how quickly can we do it?
Well, my hope is that we not belabor this. We have projects that need and programs that need to move forward. Certainty for the partners makes great sense. So going past July is fine, but I would prefer that we really, no new information has come about that has not been discussed in the committee. And I think what we have is we have advocacy for positions, which I anticipate. At some point, we need to determine what the best path forward is, and do we have enough information to be able to do that? So I would state that I don't hear anything that hasn't already been really thought about. The greenhouse gas piece, I think that is something that I would not want to have us lose our way on. And I think that's a side conversation that we need to be having, and then developing what options, if any, need to come back to the OTC. But I think that is outside of the formula and outside of what we have as a compromise brought forward. And we did even discuss what's the difference between consensus, what's the definition of consensus. I mean, we went way down a rabbit hole where we just wanted to shoot the rabbit at the end of the day. But don't call me that. But sorry, Director Garrett. But I think if we can get to the 3% for the small cities, does that make sense? I mean, let's start to narrow. If that makes sense, great. The accountability factors, I think we have outlined here. Commissioner Lohman mentioned the one where we are really prescriptive and targeted might be a little bit too much. If we can, again, give direction to the team on our thoughts, they can develop that to come back to us in July. The piece that's going to be the outlier are the formula calculations. And again, I don't know what more we could talk about outside of it doesn't really feel great, because we have challenges in the Rogue Valley that are unique, but in my opinion considered. We have on the table a bridge funding proposal that we would continue to refine, which I think is a recognition of not only the partnership, but what it means to the state of Oregon to have that drastic of a change for one particular area. So in response, it's a long way to get to. My hope is July, but I am your chair and will serve it what you need.
Thank you. Sometimes progress doesn't feel very good, but I think it is progress, and thank you. And if, I think July is, it's our next meeting, if we can move forward while we have general agreement.
Okay.
So, and I'm all for you spending a lot more time on it.
I thought you liked me. Our last meeting was 4 hours, and I thought there's no way we'll use all that time, and by golly, we did. We actually needed a little bit more. So I personally have spent more on this than really any. I don't know of another issue, even the bike ped plan. So, Commissioner Lohman.
So I'm gathering that the PAC group is reluctantly willing to meet again to talk a little more about the accountability factors and no. I'm just trying to determine what's going to be on our plate. I kind of agree that we ought to make a decision at the next meeting. But I'm trying to figure out what's going to happen between now and then. I'm not particularly interested in going back and readdressing the formula. I think you have worked diligently and painfully to get there, and unless something drastic happens, I'm inclined to say stick with that. But I'm interested in hearing a little bit about the accountability ideas on the accountability factor. I don't know where those ideas will come from, whether that's going to be staff presenting pros and cons and ups and downs, or whether the PAC will do that. And similarly on the phase-in adjustment, I'm interested in sort of thinking about that myself and in hearing more input, but I'm not sure where the input will come from, whether that's a staff-only thing or whether the PAC's going to get together and talk about that.
Well, I would submit that the PAC would be willing to get together to talk about any item other than the formula calculation. I just don't know that we will make further progress on that. I do think it's important that the formula was created to take into account as best we can, agnostic to the partner, and more about a formula that should we have new eligible areas, that they meet the federal requirements in a strategic approach that has been outlined by the OTC. So if there are other pieces, this bridge funding, different things, I don't think the group would, we can get the band back together, but I just think we're not going to be singing the calculation formula song.
No, I think you're asking yourselves too much if you do that.
Okay.
And it may be asking too much on the other two issues. I just don't know.
Okay.
I'll be interested in hearing, even if you don't get back together, the individual regions giving us more perspective on that, although you have to a large degree today.
Please.
Then maybe there's just up to staff to make some recommendations and up to us to react to them.
So Commissioner Lohman, a couple suggestions I might make in full transparency to our partners in the crowd. I think based on the conversation today, I would recommend that we put forward that we do a 3% allocation to the small jurisdictions in line with kind of what we presented today. That we stick with what's called option 2A. So again, there was a number of options. That's kind of the number that was associated with what was presented today. That we include an option for what a bridge funding would look like, a couple options for you to consider within that. That for the accountability one, that we look at the narrowed list of projects. I think primarily based on your comments today, Commissioner Lohman, as well as some that we heard from the PAC before, I think the first option of having to develop a report is just another level of effort then that a jurisdiction has to do. So in reaching that particular option, I think staff's going to have to put a little finer point to what it means to refine those. And what I would suggest is that once we've written that out in between now and the July OTC meeting, we share that with the PAC via email. We get some feedback. We bring that feedback when we come back in July. So then that way we have a full proposal before you of the formula allocations of that accountability metric.
And I think that makes a lot of sense. And if it turns out the PAC members are, after they see those options laid out, say, if they end up saying, we really want to get together and we think we can refine this better and reach an agreement, maybe then we would say, call them back together and see about that. My guess is that won't be the case. There'll just be differing positions.
Am I correct in hearing Commissioner Lohman's going to volunteer to take
That's
your...
what I heard.
No, wait a minute.
That's absolutely what I heard, yes. Commissioner Brown, comments?
Yes, thank you. I too appreciate all the work that's gone into this. I know, Chair Bainey, you mentioned how difficult some of the meetings were. I think I really appreciate all the PAC members sticking with this. I personally am not comfortable with option 2A. I think that the focus of CMAQ funds needs to focus on air quality. Maybe that's just me. I guess I've been a Lone Ranger before, so I don't mind staying that way. I do think the small cities allocation is fine. I think we need to make sure that we do protect what their needs are and maybe look at the funding every third year for some larger projects. I do think we need to look at project base and see what the money goes for the CMAQ and really what the improvements are. I would hate to see any region that's getting cut significantly to fall back into non-attainment for any reason. And so I really want to look, to me, strategically and look at what does this money buy us. It's not about protecting funds, but protecting air quality. So I need a little more time with this one. I'm not ready to jump on board with 2A. And again, appreciate being able to listen and hear what everybody else has to say. Thank you.
And Commissioner Brown, your background with CMAQ please include us so that we can understand that perspective as well. And I think that we may not all agree, but I want to better understand where we might disagree. And whatever it is that you need in order to feel prepared for July, the team is ready to provide for you as well. Please, Commissioner.
I just want to say that after sitting and listening through all this, I'm sure hoping that Phil Ditzler will be able to pull a rabbit out of the hat.
Not the rabbit we've shot, of course. Oh, okay. Do you have what you need? All right, team. Thank you.
Thank you.
We are going to take a 3-minute break.
Meeting will come to order.
Hey, Sean. We are back. Do we have Commissioner Brown on the line?
I'm here.
Excellent. Thank you for affording us the few moments to stretch our legs and get some water. Okay, next item on the agenda is item O, a discussion around the Oregon Department of Transportation's Management Review Task Implementation Reporting Process. Mr. Brower, please.
Madam Chair, members of the Commission, for the record, I'm Travis Brower, the Assistant Director, and I'm going to walk you through the latest progress on the management review and the implementation of the tasks that came out of DAS's recommendations back in April when Katie Koba came to the Commission. In the last couple of months, we've made a lot of progress and are moving forward on many of these tasks. For example, the strategic business plan and the associated activities related to that is moving forward. We had a request for proposals that went out on the street in record time. That closed on Monday, and we now have a set of proposals in our hands from the consulting firms who would like to do that work. We're going to be reviewing those. Commissioner Brown will be part of that effort, and Commissioner Bainey, I believe you will be part of the interview process. So that we hope that by the end of this month, we will be able to give a notice of intent to award to one of those firms and then move forward on a very rapid timeline of developing that strategic business plan and the agency success metrics that will come from that. Today, I'm going to do a couple of things. First, I'm going to walk through the report we are going to give you on a monthly basis and get your feedback there. And then I want to talk you through two of the particular elements. One, the communications plan that DAS requested, and the second is the item around alignment of our key performance measures. So, starting with this document that is in your packet that we posted online, we want to have a very open and transparent process in which we communicate with the Commission and with our stakeholders and with Odot employees on where we are in this process. So we have developed a very brief and high-level monthly report that we would like to present to the Commission. This is on the online documents, and it includes two pieces. One is essentially a project schedule. The second is a very brief summary of each of the elements, of the 8 elements of the report, or the progress report, and then a summary of what we have done in the current month and what we're going to be doing in the coming month. So what I wanted to do today is just put this in front of you for discussion, and if get your feedback. Is this the right amount of information? Do you need more? Do you need less? Do you need different information? And then we will modify it as with any direction from you and continue to provide this to the Commission and stakeholders and staff on a monthly basis. Of course, this is not your only chance to modify it. If at some point in the future you would like additional information, then please tell us that, and we would be happy to modify it at any point in the future. But we can get your feedback today and then move forward with this and post this regularly for you.
Do we have comments or edits? Commissioner Brown, do you have comments on this particular part of the presentation?
No, it just means more work. So I feel your pain, Chair Bainey. Thank you.
I'm working with the legislature to add days to the week. I'm going to add it to a bill, one of them.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes.
Well, of course, it's not just more work for us. It's more work. It's a lot more work for the whole team.
Yes.
Well, we hope we've developed a relatively streamlined process that will provide insight for us as executives into the status of all these as well as for you. So don't worry about the workload for ODOT. This progress report will come together very quickly and very easily.
Is that a request for more
work
tasks?
Yes, Commissioner Lohman, please give us additional assignments, whatever you need. All right, the second item then that I wanted to bring before you is related to the communications plan that DAS requested as one of its recommendations. You'll recall that in the McKinsey management review, stakeholder engagement was one of ODOT's very strong areas of performance. And yet within that area, McKinsey said that though it is a very strong area for the department, that there are opportunities to work on transparency of decision-making within the department. And I'll read you a couple of the quotes from the McKinsey report that I thought were particularly interesting. One said that transparency is the area where Odot can most improve its engagement with ACTS. 29% of ACTS survey respondents do not think Odot's decision-making is transparent and accessible. Secondly, comments and interviews of advisory committee members revealed lingering confusion about how high-level decisions are made by the department and the commission. A third quote was, public stakeholders find Odot's decision-making process more opaque than other groups do. So we see there that even though we did come out very well in this area of stakeholder engagement, the transparency was a concern. And so that translated into the recommendation from DAS to have a communications plan that outlines how input is solicited, how that input is used in the decision-making process, and how resulting decisions are communicated back to stakeholders. So this is a really good time for us to get this recommendation. We are already working to implement this recommendation and implement it really as part of the 21 through 24 STIP that we will begin next month. You'll hear about that a lot more next month. But when we begin that process, we want to engage Oregonians, engage our advisory committees, engage metropolitan planning organizations with a high degree of transparency. We want to make sure that we are providing them the information they need to understand the decision-making process about how that STIP is being developed, how the allocation decisions are made, and then ultimately as we go through the process, how the project selection decisions are made. We're also going to try to make this as accessible as possible. As you know, we're already streaming these commission meetings so that people can see them both in real time and in archive video online. We're going to be providing regular email updates, and our area managers are going to be regularly communicating with the area commissions on transportation as well as with metropolitan planning organizations. So we will use this STIP process as sort of a stepping stone to start this work on the communications plan and really implement it before we even write the plan. We will also be doing the same thing if the legislature passes a transportation funding package. We will try to engage that in a very accessible, transparent, and open manner and provide the public opportunity to see what we are doing. There are a number of provisions in the legislation that the legislature is considering that would require additional layers of transparency and accountability and accessibility of the public to information. And so we would hope that as a result of this work, we will have that transparency and accessibility of information and reporting back to stakeholders about our decision-making process from the point at which the Commission begins the process of allocating funding to projects all the way through project selection and even into project development, project delivery with new tools on our website that will provide more up-to-date information on projects across the state. So there are a number of other elements that will be included in this. There was particularly a recommendation that the Commission, the communications plan should give special emphasis to reaching out to low-income communities and communities of color. We're going to be engaging that largely in the project development and delivery stage, not so much in the project selection or project funding allocation. But we will be wrapping this all up into a communications plan that will come back to the Commission then for discussion in the fall. The due date for that to DAS is on December 1st. So we'll have that before you. So I'll pause there, and if there's any feedback as we begin this process that you want to make sure that we're considering items as we move forward, I would be happy to take that now.
I have a quick question. So McKinsey reached out to a group of individuals and organizations and received feedback about transparency, but I'm wondering if transparency means the same thing and they all share in the same understanding of what their perceived lack of transparency looks like. And so I'm wondering, is there a way for us to go back to those that were asked to further glean from them? What is it that you felt was missing so that we are not trying to provide an answer to an issue that we haven't really been able to hear clearly on? Is it? I'm not maybe saying that quite right, but is there a way to get from them what they meant by that?
Commissioner Boehne, well, I guess, is there a consensus on the meaning of transparency? Is there a consensus on the meaning of consensus?
And the
to your
answer to
earlier
that
question.
is no.
So we will be regularly engaged in discussions with those stakeholders, particularly the ACTS and the MPOs, and that will be one of the questions the area managers and Odot staff are asking them,
Yeah.
what do you need for a transparent process? What do you need as stakeholders in the public to understand this, to influence it, to comment, to impact it? So we'll be having those regular discussions with those stakeholders.
One of the pieces that comes to mind is that through the Connect process, there were a lot of questions around how the advisory, who filters what information, who makes what decisions before. I just wonder if some of this isn't more program specific than agency wide, and being able to mine that down a little better would help us to understand what we're trying to target, because transparency is such a core value and such an important piece that we strive for, that being able to better understand what that means.
Yeah, Chair Boehne, it's a good question. I think if you look at the chart that McKinsey put in their report, if you read that section, it was clear one of the areas that we struggle with the most is the metropolitan planning organizations. And it was clear that the ACTs actually gave us pretty good grades, as you can see, across those areas. They hit us a little bit on transparency, but it was really the MPOs. Part of that comes from the role of the ACT versus the MPO, where the ACT is the official commission advisory committee. The MPO plays a slightly different role that is more not as direct in its advisory role. And so I think we're going to need to look at those specific findings and keep that in mind. It wasn't clear if Connect Oregon was the one of the issues there. I would certainly think that we've heard that concern, which is always a good reminder that as much as you think you have communicated and explained the process through multiple rounds of a program that really has not changed that much, at times you have not communicated enough or appropriately so that people truly understand what a complex process looks like.
Madam Chair, I think you bring up a good point, and if you listen to some of the words Travis used as he was reading from the assessment, and you go back to some of the meetings we've had, you can almost attribute those to some of the programs we were speaking about, and I think Connect Oregon is one of the issues that's being referenced in maybe 2 of the 3 quotations that Mr. Brower spoke to. That said, I think it's a good point. We can aspire to be a little bit better. Obviously, there is some confusion. There may be tensions about process, different groups adjudicating who trumps who. I mean, those have been existing issues with the Connect Oregon program for several cycles here. I think that may have rolled into this conversation as well. That said, it's just a motivator to make sure that there's a soup to nuts communication as we move forward. There should not be any concerns or the terms a lack of transparency. It should be self-evident to folks as to how we receive the input we make available or access folks to this, and in the end of the day, people understand how you got from point A to point B. And that's, I think, the motivation and the rationale behind the efforts that we will engage in.
Commissioner Holland and then Commissioner Lohman.
I just want to sort of grain of salt, I guess. I mean, I agree some of it had to do with some concerns about decisions on the Connect. I think some of these concerns that got expressed as lack of transparency, some of them I think date back to the switch over to Enhance and Fix It, where there was some confusion for the first time and maybe even the second time around.
Good point.
And some of it, frankly, is people who didn't get what they exactly wanted, or you know, I certainly hear this all the time in my job now and in previous jobs in the public sector. They'll say, well, I wasn't informed, I didn't get a chance to have my say, and it's really about not getting what they wanted because of a difficult decision-making process, and we're never going to be perfect on this, and we shouldn't over-rev. And I mean, this transparency is important. Making sure the public understands as much as possible is important. But we can spend so much time on communication that we don't do our work. So we've got to be real careful about the balance here. It's one of the reasons people complain about inefficiency in government, because we spend all our time trying to communicate and make sure every stakeholder gets his or her say, and then it's hard to get the work done on time. And so just there's got to be a balance in here somewhere.
So my question on this particular chart, is this a McKinsey rating or an ODOT rating?
No, this was lifted directly from the McKinsey report based on their survey of stakeholders and interview of stakeholders.
So on areas that are green, does it mean we're not doing anything? We're leaving them as they are? Are we focused on yellow and red?
Commissioner O'Halloran, we're certainly focused on yellow and red, but certainly we want to ensure that our entire process, even where we're good, we're going to try to get a little bit better, but certainly where we may have the most remedial work is where we'll try the hardest to improve. So we're trying to do a very comprehensive approach regardless.
Understand, and I think that this is a snapshot that was McKinsey's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important to note, do legislators still think we are delivering on those measures, and that it not just be us content with a one-time snapshot rating, that these are variables that will change, and that the perspective from stakeholders and legislators and advisory committees and acts will evolve, right? And maybe we were good when McKenzie took this, but I think it's important to keep pulse checking, and that it's not us grading ourselves, but these people and various interests still saying that we are meeting these, and that the green's not turned to yellow along the way.
Commissioner Allen, thank you for a reminder that Jerry Bohard has indicated that there is a requirement by the federal government to do a survey of stakeholders as part of the planning process. And we're looking at perhaps using that as an opportunity after this STIP, after funding package, project selection, and other activities, to go back and sort of resurvey similar groups with maybe similar questions and use that baseline data to compare to the new efforts and see if we have moved the needle.
Okay, are you getting from us what you need?
Yep.
Okay. Commissioner Brown, do you have any comments?
No additional comments. I think I'm looking forward to this process, and I know it will be a long process to get through, but I really appreciate all the work that's being done. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.
The other task that I wanted to preview with you today is around aligning our key performance measures with agency goals and the agency mission. I actually think that this is a misnamed task in a sense, because KPMs, by their very definition, are legislatively imposed. So what we're proposing is that we as an agency, through the process of the strategic business plan and success metrics effort, and through our own internal process that we have with our performance measurement leadership team, will really focus on what we're calling core performance measures. These are the decision-making performance measures that we use as an agency to steer the ship of state. And so we will go through this process and propose a set of core performance measures to the legislature. It's likely that for various reasons the legislature will request that additional performance measures be reported to the legislature, and that's fine. But we will view the core performance measures as the ones we as an agency will really use and that the report to the commission to steer this agency. I also included up on this slide the federal performance measures. We've heard about these. These were mandated under MAP 21. To the extent that they overlap with our core performance measures, we will use them. We will incorporate them. For example, two of the safety measures that the federal government has promulgated are essentially in alignment with our core performance measures. Many of them, however, are not. They're not quite right. They measure the wrong level of something, or they don't do it in as in-depth a way. So, for example, with bridges, we have a great bridge performance measure that the federal government performance measure we just don't think is quite right. So we are going to focus on those core performance measures. These are the ones that we'll bring to the commission, and the federal performance measures we'll treat more as a reporting requirement to the federal government, but not the ones that we will use to manage the agency and manage the transportation system. We have already made significant progress over the last couple of biennia in order to better align our key performance measures with our agency goals. This is something we've been doing actually for 2 biennia in a row now. We have consolidated the number of key performance measures. We've modified some. We've incorporated new ones, and we're going to continue that work starting this month of starting to scrub these a little bit better. So, for example, we know some of these may not be quite right. Our construction on time measure, for example, doesn't really measure what the public sees around a project, so we think we can do a little bit better with that one. Others of these may need a little bit of tweaking here and there as well. What we're going to do, though, is we have this performance measurement leadership team that's going to work through those. At the same time, the strategic business plan is going to be developing that agency strategic business plan. This work around KPMs internally will help inform that effort, but ultimately it will be that strategic business plan and the success metrics that come out of that process that will fully inform our key performance measures that we will propose to the legislature. So we intend to start moving forward on this very soon, and we'll be reporting to the Commission on the progress we make in that regard, and then we'll complete this ultimately as part of that strategic business planning process. So that was all I had for you today, and I'd be happy to take any further comments on this item or any other aspect.
I think one other thing, in the budget that, again, will go to the full Ways and Means Committee tomorrow, there is a budget note that actually speaks to this issue and is in perfect alignment with this issue in terms of the potential refinement and alignment between our strategic business plan and when we come back to the Legislative Assembly with with the next biennium's budget here. So again, we're all in sync in terms of policy assessments and budget as we move forward on this front.
Yeah. One other note I should say, this set of key performance measures that's on the screen and is also posted online are ones that we proposed to the legislature as part of the budget process, and on Monday when they moved our budget out of subcommittee, they accepted that recommendation and included that budget note. So this is the new set of KPMs that will be, knock on wood, approved by the legislature as part of our budget coming up soon, not the ones that McKinsey was staring at when they looked at our potential misalignment. So actually, I think we made, probably got about halfway toward their goal that they laid out in their report in the interim period while they were doing that.
And do we anticipate developing some sort of a dashboard for the commission so that we can be tracking and we can further refine that, obviously, but I'm sure that's...
Yeah, that's an ongoing great discussion. We have one-pagers that we do on a yearly basis, and we're looking at doing perhaps an annual performance report that's a little bit more meaningful that would roll some of that up. We already have that online, and we'd be happy to provide that to you, and we're looking to do that in the near future to be able to really show that accountability and performance.
Okay. And there are pieces here that I don't know that we would want to wait a full year. If we were really struggling on the customer service or on time budget, some of those pieces, I think being able for us to track that, obviously course corrections or inputs that may be causing challenges will not change overnight. But it also gives us an opportunity if we hear something of, I'm not sure of an example, but we would be able to say we just are tracking this closely and that hasn't come forward, or it has and we are aware.
Well, Madam Chair, I think that's a very good point. This is a dynamic process, but let's just take the very first one. We certainly know traffic fatalities over the last couple of years have spiked. A lot of questions as to why. But you've also made some decisions in that Transportation Safety Action Plan, the TSAP plan, that has initiatives in there that may well indeed bend that line to some extent. Now, there are other fingers and hands on the reins, so to speak, when you're dealing with that performance measure. But you've already taken some action. So it's the dynamic process that I think is in place that I think can inform things. Better definitions. Travis broached one that I think we're far too restrictive in the way we define delivering projects on time or construction projects on time. If it's open to traffic, that's all people need to want to know. We don't need all the paperwork done, but yet we do that, and I think we handicap ourselves, and when you start to hold yourself up against other people who have different definitions, not as rigid as ours, you know, when comparing, we're a little lower than them. Well, it's not to move the goalpost, it's to bring some common sense to the conversation and to ask ourselves the question, truly, how much responsibility do we have there? And should we have a performance measure that we really don't have much responsibility because it's influenced by different externalities to a greater extent than what is influenced by us and our actions. So we're asking those types of questions, and I think that will be the ongoing process as we step back and look at the strategic business plan and we start to, again, refine and focus where we go and surgically strike some of the initiatives to, again, hold up against these performance measures here because they are the dictator, as you say. They are the dashboard that are indicating, are you doing what you said you're going to do? And if you're not, how do you correct them? So,
I think of agenda development, let's take the first one there as well, being able to bring that before the commission so that we are fully informed if there are any trends that we are seeing, if there are policy decisions that maybe we hadn't considered or things that we could be doing. I think something as significant as our increase in fatalities, making sure that in our development of those agendas that we are taking into account some of the things that we are seeing here and making sure that we're using it as for not just informing, but also any sort of policy prep or considerations that we might be wanting to develop.
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. While we go ahead and get ready for our next to the last item, which is Ms. Dinsdale is going to be going over the Office of Innovation and Automated Vehicle Technology. I'd like to go ahead and consider the consent agenda. And I also want to offer, I understand that we're going to be going over, this presentation will be captured on video, so it can also be viewed. If anyone needs to peel off, or Commissioner Brown, I'm not sure what you have as well, but I just want to offer that. And I do understand that, Commissioner Brown, you may have comments on the consent agenda. So, Director Garrett, if we do not have any edits or revisions to the consent agenda, then I would go ahead with the minutes.
I think that's fair, and I think hearing no concerns for the specific consent calendar items, I have heard none, so I would ask approval unless there are some minute adjustments that I think have taken place. Is that correct?
So I would welcome a motion and then discussion if we have any comments on the consent agenda as presented.
Madam Chair, I move approval of the consent agenda.
Okay. Further discussion? Commissioner Brown, do you have any comments?
No issues, so I'm ready to vote.
Okay, excellent. So all those in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Okay, motion carries. So wonderful to see you. I know that we are going to be keeping you a little past, but we will get to your presentation because this helps set us up for decisions in the future, near future. So the floor is yours.
There we go. Good afternoon, Chair Bamey, members of the Commission. For the record, my name is Erica Dinsdale, and I'm ODOT's Chief Innovation Officer. Commissioner Brown, I believe you have a copy of the presentation in your packet. There might be a slide or two that's in slightly different order. And, okay, you might have they're pictures, so hopefully we should be able to follow along. And if you have any questions, please, as always, don't hesitate to stop me. I'm here today to share with you a new direction for my office, as well as an update on a key program area that we talked about briefly in February. For many of you who've been around ODOT for quite a while, you'll recognize that these three groups that were previously housed separately are now all together in the now titled Office of Innovation. And when I was asked to serve as ODOT's Chief Innovation Officer, we knew that we needed to reestablish my new office's purpose. As an agency, we continue to have opportunity in front of us to pursue innovative policies and strategies. ODOT thrives when we can deliver the mission of the agency effectively and efficiently and integrate it into the core operational divisions of the agency. And we excel when we can continue to do it better and better for the citizens and businesses of Oregon. But the world around us does not arrive in a neatly packaged box with a goal wrapped around it in a specific mode or a specific division. And we have and we will continue to have game-changing aspirations that cross over our divisions, cross over our modes, and cross over our ways of thinking. So we need a place to incubate these new ideas, to do the hard work of developing policies and practices, and make ready key efforts to be operationalized in other parts of the agency. So to figure out how to describe and identify this agency need, we embarked on an exercise with some key agency executives and staff to learn how they have used some of the key services in the past and what their thoughts were for partnership going forward. Once we heard their perspective and synthesized it, we took it for a test drive. back out through some of those same folks, and adding others in to provide feedback. What we ended up with is a mission that I believe will serve the agency for years to come. Forward-thinking and collaborative on those tough challenges that lie ahead. But I'm not one to do interviews and just have a lot of discussion just for the heck of it. I'm one to get things done. So when I really thought about what this effort was about and what this work could help us with, it was really 3 things for my team and for the agency while they were engaging with us. The first was how we focus our scarce resources on what those high value priorities are, how we align our efforts with each other and with the agency as a whole, and how we clearly communicate with internal and external stakeholders about the value we deliver. So at its core, this is our mission. The Odot Office of Innovation partners with internal and external organizations to identify, assess, and promote strategic innovations that advance our multimodal transportation system in this fast-changing transportation environment. We do so by seeking out new developments and developers that can help lead us to opportunities and change at a system level, by creating opportunities for cooperation with private industry, developing policy and processes that can realize the value of these innovations, and collaborating with internal groups to ready the agency for long-term implementation. Our guiding principles help us both in how we do our work within my team, but also how we engage with others outside. And it's actually my favorite part of this work that we did, but I'm going to highlight a couple of them. First, collaboration is our middle name. We convene a diverse range of organizations and experts in all aspects of our work, from evaluating a new idea through integrating it into how we do business. We also recognize that significant innovation is happening all across Odot, and it has to. But our office focuses on big innovation that's outside of current operations, the game changers in how we define our business. The Office of Innovation has proven expertise with the procurement process provided by the Oregon Innovative Partnership Program. We use it as a tool to pursue innovations with private industry, and when needed, we can facilitate its use with internal groups who similarly can benefit. Lastly, governance of my team's portfolio is at the agency level. It's not just those super shiny things that we think are fun to do. It's those important items that further the agency and our mission, and our agency mission. So here's a look at our current strategic priorities. First of all, leading the agency's policy position and facilitating early implementation of automated vehicles in our transportation system. We're also working on preparing the agency to integrate road usage charging and the Origo program into their business. We're facilitating cross-agency, cross-industry collaboration that will prepare the state for connected vehicles, especially early integration with our infrastructure. We lead the agency's application of the public-private partnership procurement tool, which, as you know, is a close collaboration between the OTC's approval for its use and the agency resources to deliver against that direction. And lastly, enabling the transportation system infrastructure to accommodate growth in electric vehicles. Our team members are small in number, but we come together with a wide skill set to tackle many problems that come our way.
And they look so happy.
Yes, I bring a lot of chocolate to work, yes.
Yay.
You've seen many of these talented people in front of you before in the past several years, and you will continue to again as we move these priorities forward. So now you know a little bit about the focus of my team. I wanted to spend a few minutes discussing a pressing topic that we have in front of us, the testing and deployment of highly automated vehicles on Oregon's roads. Automated vehicles represent a transformation in our transportation system. They're going to change how we experience our communities around us, like the evolution from a horse and buggy to a Model T, or the automobile to the connectivity of the interstate system. The next step in deployment of self-driving cars and trucks will challenge our current assumptions and familiarity with how the transportation system serves our citizens and our businesses. How we get there is going to happen in a number of ways, from a slow evolution of the cars we drive today to become more and more automated, to other vehicle manufacturers jumping right in with full, complete automation. But what's important when we talk about the levels of automation of these vehicles is who, or really what, is monitoring the environment. In this context, we're only talking about those highly automated vehicles, level 3 and higher, which really just think of it as the green stuff up on the chart. Those vehicles where, at least in some circumstances, the system is designed to be the one monitoring the environment instead of the human. Automated vehicles are also being developed for different objectives and purposes. Things like freight fuel efficiency, last mile transit shuttles, ride sharing, or people owning their own AVs. And companies in Oregon are actively pursuing these opportunities today. Highly automated vehicle technology is here now. And to give you a feel for what's already in existence, I want you to meet Steve. Can we click on the link? I don't know how to click with this. The wonders of YouTube. So this is Steve. Steve, in his adult life, has lost 95% of his vision. And other videos describes the impact that this has had on his life. The difficulty in being able to get to work, loss of freedom, loss of independence. But here he is in 2015 on the public streets of Austin, Texas, going for a ride in an automated vehicle. The sound, by the way, it's picture, pretty music. Except here what he's saying is I've never been to Austin, Texas. Yet here I am driving in a vehicle all by myself around the public streets of Austin, Texas. So this actually happened in Austin 2 years ago. Testing is actively happening in other states, and we know it's happening here too. So the thing in front of us to think about is, what is our role as the state of Oregon and the Department of Transportation, and what should we be thinking about and doing next? You can go back to it. It'll end just in a second. Thank you, Jackie. So you've heard before that Odot has an internal team of experts in their field from across the department to come together and work on connected vehicle and automated vehicle issues of importance to our agency. And these are the current focus areas for 2017. Our goal is to pull together insight and experience from all of our divisions and business lines to make informed recommendations in the space of connected vehicles and automated vehicles. One really important piece of work over this last year has been the establishment of our automated vehicle testing voluntary notification program. This engagement has been crucial as we build partnerships and understand the development of industry testing. In fall of 2016, NHTSA issued draft guidance about automated vehicle policy, and this really gave us a roadmap as we navigate the federal, state, and local landscape, and really recommends that we work to implement the model state policy here in Oregon. This policy guides states to a consistent approach across the country while recommending a consistent division of federal and state responsibilities. The current federal responsibilities as it relates to vehicles are things like setting safety standards for new vehicles. So think about backup cameras and airbags and safety belts and things like that. That's a federal role. Where the state responsibilities are things like licensing human drivers, registering motor vehicles, enacting and enforcing traffic laws and regulations. And we really expect that this common division between federal and state role should continue into the future. It is also likely that as motor vehicle equipment increasingly performs those driving functions that today a human does, that the federal government will likely regulate safety of that equipment increasingly instead of the state licensing a human driver. NHTSA has also included model state guidance as a recommendation of things states should be doing regarding automated vehicle testing and deployment. And this has really helped us to navigate the federal and state responsibilities, but also give us a clear path to engage in the automated vehicle testing and deployment discussions that we have ahead of us. So following the NHTSA model state policy and anticipating what questions will be coming at us, we have three key recommendations. The first is lead agency designation. Many other states, as you know, DMV, the Highway Department, Transportation Safety, state police, insurance regulators, and all, are in all kinds of different combinations of agencies. But here in Oregon, we have some of those core functions housed here in Odot. NHTSA recommends designating one agency as the lead agency to take the lead in coordinating with all the various ones so that we know who's on first. And Odot is seeking this lead agency designation. The second recommendation is the establishment of what NHTSA has called the Jurisdictional Automated Safety Technology Committee, or an acronym so bad that I don't know that we'll be able to perpetuate it for a hugely long time, but it's really the forum for coordination between jurisdictions. So if established, this would really look like starting with education and information so that all agencies can come up to speed to understand the technology, the national conversation, and the issues, and be kept up to date by the lead agency on the current state of testing in the state, and eventually be able to work on and provide input to some really complex questions. And the third recommendation is the creation of a stakeholder working group. As you can imagine, stakeholders for this topic are far-reaching. From lawyers to insurance to technology companies, auto manufacturers, user groups, there's many who wish to have a strong voice in this urgent and complex policy conversation here in Oregon. And as we move to future legislative sessions, having a way to work that out, or at least articulate those issues, is going to be really helpful. As we think about it, the difference between testing and deployment is really important. And I know we've talked about this before, but I want to make sure we emphasize it. Testing is happening now. It's going to have a limited number of vehicles with highly skilled resources at the ready to take over. While a deployment setting contemplates a large number of fully autonomous vehicles, Steve is going to be in one of those vehicles when he comes to visit Oregon, riding around. My kids are going to get to all of their activities in these vehicles, so a very different scenario. So when we engage in our discussions, being clear on which phase we're talking about is really important to continue the momentum in order to move into the future. So today, we can't prevent AVs from testing on our streets, and we can't require anyone to notify us of their testing plans. But as we continue to monitor the national landscape, connect with companies in Oregon who wish to test and monitor legislative bills, the technology showing up on public roads is moving fast and then faster. Oregon needs to develop state policy and potential regulation before AVs are deployed on a large scale rather than trying to regulate them after the fact, and many states have already developed these frameworks. The bills pertaining to automated vehicles failed to make their way through key milestones in this year's crowded legislative session. And although the session's not over, we are turning our attention to work to be done to prepare for future conversations with our lawmakers. A legislative work group was recently formed by Representatives McLean and Vial to address automated vehicles with a group of stakeholders with a goal of coming up with a bill for 2018 or 2019. And this group is actively engaged. In fact, they just finished one of their work sessions maybe about a half an hour ago. So they're meeting frequently. Governor Brown recently convened a policy meeting with state representatives, tech companies, and other stakeholders in late May to kick off a policy group that she hopes will begin to meet regularly after session ends. And that meeting was facilitated by our very own Commissioner O'Halloran. And it was the governor's first opportunity to speak about AVs in a public forum. She focused on safety and economic opportunity and welcomed automated vehicles to Oregon. Also of note is the recent City of Portland announcement welcoming AV testing through an RFI process so they will have control over parameters and location. The RFI was released Monday, and the council hearing in support of it and accompanying rules was held last night. So as we look forward towards the future, this is an exciting time for our team, for Odot, and for the great state of Oregon. Odot's Office of Innovation stands ready to pursue and develop game-changing concepts, policies, and inventions towards safe and efficient transportation system for all Oregonians. Thank you.
Wonderful. We do have an individual who would like to provide testimony on this item as well. And so do we have any questions for Ms. Dinsdale before? Please.
No, just thank you. And I think that one of the things that came out of that stakeholder meeting was that we need to move with some sense of speed. Just if we want to capture the economic development opportunity that is presented here, I would encourage us to have Senator McClain and Representative Weil come before the commission so that our efforts are coordinated with the legislature and we're not seen as running cross purposes with each other. I think we could have the governor, we could request the governor to participate via executive order to tell us to develop rules and to designate ODOT as the lead agency. And I think we can work with the governor's office toward that end. But I think designating ODOT as the lead agency, I think is a small step. It's a logical step, but that would allow us to quickly establish the testing protocol to move forward and encourage, and again, I think on your spectrum of all the way to fully automated, we're not talking about fully automated. We're talking about a much higher percentage of automation, and I think we have a long way to go to get there. And I think Portland, is being very aggressive on this, but I think we just need to dip our toe in the water a little further and incentivize development and us really figuring out what the true issues are here. And there isn't a lot preventing deployment right now as long as they're not all the way into that fully automated side. They have a driver behind the wheel and so there's that element of it. And the technology is infusing itself into vehicles now with adaptive cruise control and lane departure technology, et cetera. So a lot of this stuff is coming, So anyway, thank you. I think there are steps we can take quickly without a lot of effort that are very obvious that just kind of the right one. So
thank you. Please.
Obviously, getting to the point where we're kind of on the leading edge of managing automated vehicles, I think is real important. I don't want to lose our focus also on vehicle miles traveled.
Absolutely.
I still think that's a technology and a process that can be very useful for us in the future. I also, although it relates to automated vehicles, we're talking about in the Public Transportation Policy Advisory Committee the impact of new technologies on transit, and we need to. I think we're going to need to end up being very involved as a state in that. I know there's a fairly small town in Canada that has now scrapped their plans to do transit, and they set up a contract with Uber. Where they pay a base rate to Uber, and then the rider pays a certain amount over that. There's other groups kind of like Uber that I think Juno is one of them that's operating in Texas that focuses on just working with public entities. It's not the Uber model, but it's using that Uber phone technology. And I can't help but think we're going to be smart if we try some pilot projects in this state where communities can try out some things and sort of get to the leading edge, again, in public transportation that either supplements or in some cases maybe even replaces fixed route transit. And I don't want to lose that. There's just so much going on, and it seems like your office is going to be right in the middle of it. I don't want to get just focused on highways. Good luck. I think you're into a very interesting arena, and keep your eyes wide open. Don't get just too focused on those 3 areas that you identified.
No, I agree. Thank you, Commissioner Lohman. I will just say on your transit comment, I think you're spot on. I think we have a lot of creativity in front of us on how we can leverage the automated vehicle technology to be able to achieve some of the goals that perhaps we have not been able to achieve. And I just hope we can do that in a coordinated way. I know we're right now trying to have my key smart person get really involved in the public transportation plan so that we can be having that eye towards transit in particular. And I think it's important that we think about what's right for Oregon. And what's right in Burns is going to be different than what's right in Portland. And being able to think of those right connection points to be able to serve the needs of those communities is going to look different. In Portland, if we scrapped our fixed route transit and had everybody in individual Ubers, that's probably not going to work either, right? So, but last mile connection might. Being able to extend that distance between the max and where people live would perhaps provide some dramatic difference. So thinking through in the different communities and the different scenarios, and then getting to freight and getting to all kinds of things on how this will fundamentally change our transportation system and how we can do it in a smart way that helps us meet a lot of our other goals that aren't highway specific dependent is really, I think, what's exciting about this work.
And I think just some fairly simple things like model contracts with providers in the public transportation area, where we've got a private-public partnership. You got a little community like mine.
Right.
We don't have the technical expertise to put together a contract, but there are people doing that all around the country and around the world, and having somebody sort of tracking that and helping us figure out what are good model contracts could make a big difference without a lot of investment.
Great, thank you.
Very good. So please stay on standby just in case we have questions. And Chris, I'd like to have you join us. Ms. Hagerbaumer, great to see you. Please state your name, as always, for the record, and the floor is yours.
Hi, Commissioner Bainey and members of the Commission. My name is Chris Hagerbaumer. I am the Deputy Director at Oregon Environmental Council. And last night I was at this hearing at the Portland City Council, and I was like, oh, I could present the same testimony here. So I will do that. So I don't know, did any of you ever read the book? I think it was The Magnificent Ambersons by Tarkington, early 20, okay. So the protagonist in that book talks about some of the potential downsides to automobiles, right? This was the early 20th century. But I think most of our grandparents or great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents, it was like, wow, this shiny new object. And we wanted to incorporate it into our cities to the greatest extent. But when you think about what a city is about, it's really about social cohesion and businesses being close together and the economic potentials of that, of people being close together. And what we did with our cities is actually push people further apart with the automobile, if you think about it. In fact, I think more than 50% of the land in most cities is devoted to moving or storing automobiles. So we didn't get it right back then, frankly. If you were to go back in time, would you really build a transportation system like what we built? So we're now at this period, 100 years later, where this whole new potential and opportunity is in front of us. It could go well, or it could go the wrong direction. So the potential I see with automated vehicles, if done right, is that you could potentially get back a lot of that land that was devoted to the automobile and turn it into much higher value than a stupid parking lot, right? Affordable housing or whatever it is, and make cities more beautiful and more productive. Another thing that I think is a good potential is, of course, if these AVs are electric, that help. I mean, we've got to move as fast as possible to electrifying our transportation system. And also, if honestly, if we were able to use AVs in a way where they're more like public transportation and people don't have to own an automobile anymore, that could help with social equity. But there's also the nightmare scenario. And that includes, what if they're expensive and privately owned? What if they don't respond correctly to unpredictable objects like the kid running out in the road? What if they end up adding to traffic? And so that's the example of the person going to work in the morning in the AV and sending it back home, and then it coming back and picking the person up. That's twice as much traffic. It could degrade walking and cycling conditions because the concept is you can get rid of a lot of signals, right? Because the AVs don't need signals. Well, anyway, could cause conflicts. It could, as you noted, Commissioner Lohman, really undermine public transit. And I don't think public transit needs to be the way it is today in the future, but we still, especially if it has equity implications, don't want to lose public transit. And then another huge thing, and we don't think about this in the transportation world, but it is the loss of jobs. In trucking, trucking is this fantastic job for people without a college degree, and you read it all over the place that trucking jobs are going away. So what I'm getting at here is that there's a lot more to this than just, well, letting these guys ply our roads and that being a state function. I think the state also has a responsibility to be thinking really proactively about every aspect of automated vehicles and putting the right policy framework in place to make sure that we don't make the mistakes that we made a century ago. That's it.
Great. Well, let me just say that you've raised a lot of considerations, and I think as we go forward, I will look forward to making sure that there's that interaction so that we can take all of the just thoughts and considerations that are out there and concerns and opportunities and mix those into what's right for Oregon and what this looks like going forward. So yeah, I don't know that we would develop our communities the same way. Public health obviously had a lot to do with that too, and so we know more now. And I think together we can make those decisions and make sure that we're creating policies that serve us well. Thank you for making time, and thank you for staying. Oh, my goodness.
Oh, I went away during the middle of the day.
Oh, well, good. So did we. No, I'm kidding. All right. So thank you. Do we have any other questions on this? Commissioner Brown, are you still with us?
I am still with us.
All right.
I have no questions, but appreciate leaning forward and really looking at this. I also appreciate Commissioner Lohman's comments about let's not keep it just to highways. So this is, it'll be interesting to watch the developments.
Great. So I have been tracking agenda-wise I think the idea of getting a couple of legislators after session in and we have a conversation, so that's on the radar. We're just hopefully that'll be sometime while we're all still young. But I do think that getting ahead of this and making sure that we're being good stewards and creating that safety in those policies to also offer the economic opportunity that this might be able to bring about too. So thank you for the presentation, and thank you to your team of certified smart people. And with that, we've gone through the consent agenda, and I don't believe we have anything else. Is there anything else for the good of the order? Okay, I'll offer a thank you for the extra time. And Commissioner Brown, thank you for joining us, and we are adjourned. Happy birthday to your son. Yeah, sorry for